Welcome, weary traveler, to the shadowed corners of the continent where legends whisper of creatures beyond mortal understanding. Tonight, we delve into the ancient chronicles of the higher vampires, being so powerful that death itself holds no dominion over them. These are not the monsters of peasant tales, but ancient intelligences older than kingdoms, whose true nature has been shrouded in centuries of fear and misunderstanding. So settle into the embrace of night, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we explore the timeless saga of immortal beings who walk among mortals, forever changed by their exile from a distant world. In the beginning, before the continent knew the footsteps of humans or the songs of elves, before the northern kingdoms rose from wilderness, and the empire of Nilfgaard carved its dominion from southern lands, there existed worlds beyond worlds, spheres of reality separated by barriers that had endured since the dawn of creation itself. Among these distant realms, in a place whose name has been lost to the erosion of millennia, there lived a race of beings whose very existence would one day challenge everything mortals believed they understood about life, death, and the nature of monstrosity itself. The vampires, as they would come to be known by the tongues of men, were not born from curse or corruption, as so many of their supposed kindred were. They were not the products of magical accident or divine punishment, nor were they humans transformed by bite or blood or unholy ritual. They were, in the truest sense of the word, alien to the world they would eventually inhabit. Creatures whose biology and consciousness operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to the natural laws that governed other forms of life. In their original realm, these beings had evolved over eons into something that transcended the crude limitations that bound other species to cycles of birth and death. Their matter, as one of their kind would later explain to a bewildered witcher, could exist without form, requiring neither heart nor brain, nor the constant intake of air that sustained lesser creatures. They were beings of pure will made manifest in flesh that could be reshaped at whim, whose consciousness could survive the complete destruction of their physical forms, and whose understanding of existence stretched across centuries that would encompass dozens of human generations. But even in their alien perfection, even in their transcendence of mortality's basic constraints, the vampires were not a unified people. Like so many races that achieve great power and longevity, they had divided themselves along lines of philosophy and purpose, creating distinct societies that reflected different approaches to their immortal existence. 3 great tribes had emerged from their species over the course of their long history, each representing a different vision of what it meant to be vampire. The Tendet tribe, whose symbol was a serpent coiled around an open palm, had embraced a philosophy of expansion and exploration that led them to seek out new worlds and new experiences beyond the boundaries of their birth realm. They were wanderers by nature, beings who found meaning in discovery, and whose restless spirits could not be contained within the familiar territories of their homeland. When the time came for great migrations, when the barriers between worlds grew thin enough to permit passage, it would be the Ted who struck out toward the unknown eastern reaches, seeking lands beyond the Blue Mountains where they might establish new dominions far from the influence of their ancient kin. The Amaran tribe bore as their sigil a hand wielding a downward-facing dagger, and their philosophy was one of conquest and domination that saw other races as subjects to be ruled rather than equals to be respected. They were the aristocrats of vampire society, beings who believed that their superior nature entitled them to command lesser creatures and shape worlds according to their will. When the Great Dispersal began, when the conjunction of spheres offered passages to new realms, the Amaran would choose to venture westward beyond the Great Sea, seeking territories where they could establish kingdoms that would reflect their vision of vampire supremacy. But it was the 3rd tribe, the Garcane, who would become most intimately connected to the world that humans called home. Their symbol was deceptively simple, a drop of blood upon an open palm with crimson staining the fingertips, but it represented a philosophy that was perhaps the most complex and nuanced of the three vampire societies. The Garcane believed not in conquest or endless wandering, but in the possibility of coexistence, in the idea that vampires could find meaning and purpose by learning to share existence with other forms of life, rather than dominating or avoiding them entirely. This philosophical difference would prove crucial when the cosmic catastrophe, known as the conjunction of the spheres, tore through the fabric of reality itself, creating passages between worlds that had been separated since the beginning of time. The event was not planned or controlled by any single intelligence, but was rather a natural phenomenon on a scale so vast that entire civilizations were caught up in its effects without understanding what was happening to them. Worlds collided, literally and figuratively, as the barriers that had kept different spheres of existence apart suddenly dissolved in a chaos of intersecting realities. For the vampires, secure in their ancient realm and convinced of their ability to weather any crisis through their immortal nature, the conjunction came as a shock that shattered their world just as thoroughly as it destroyed the boundaries between dimensions. Their home, the sphere where their race had evolved and flourished for countless ages, was torn apart by forces beyond even their considerable power to control. The choice they faced was simple in its starkness and terrible in its implications. Flee their dying world and seek refuge in one of the alien realms now accessible through the dimensional rifts, or remain and face extinction along with everything they had ever known. The decision to abandon their birth world was not made easily or unanimously. Debates raged among the three tribes as reality crumbled around them, with some arguing that their immortal nature would allow them to survive even the complete destruction of their sphere, while others insisted that migration was the only path to continued existence. But as the chaos intensified, as the very foundations of their reality began to dissolve, it became clear that philosophical discussions were a luxury they could no longer afford. The exodus that followed was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in the history of any world. Entire populations of immortal beings, creatures whose individual lifespans exceeded the rise and fall of empires, were forced to abandon everything they had built over millennia and venture into alien realms whose laws and customs were completely foreign to their experience. The Tedet departed first, their natural wanderlust making them eager to explore the eastern possibilities that lay beyond mountain ranges they had never seen. The Aemran followed soon after, their aristocratic pride driving them to seek western territories where they could establish new kingdoms worthy of their superior nature. But the Garcane chose a different path, one that would prove both more challenging and more rewarding than their tribal cousins could have imagined. Rather than seeking empty lands where they could recreate their old way of life, the Garcane were drawn to a sphere that was already teeming with other forms of intelligent life. Humans and elves, dwarves and halflings, countless races were struggling to adapt to the chaos that the conjunction had brought to their world, and the Garcane saw in this diversity an opportunity to test their philosophical commitment to coexistence. The world they chose to call home was itself in the midst of unprecedented transformation. The conjunction had not only brought new races to the continent, but had also introduced creatures and forces that challenged the existing order in ways that no one could have predicted. Monsters from dimensions where different natural laws prevailed now roamed forests that had once been safe for human habitation. Magic, previously rare and carefully controlled, now flowed through the world with unpredictable intensity. The very landscape was being reshaped by energies that mortal minds could barely comprehend. It was into this chaos that the Garcane vampires emerged, beings whose power far exceeded anything the other inhabitants of this new world had ever encountered, but whose intentions were, at least initially, peaceful. They did not arrive as conquerors or colonizers, but as refugees seeking to build new lives in a realm that was itself struggling to find stability in the aftermath of cosmic catastrophe. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful among them that they, immortal and nearly invincible, had been driven from their homes by the same forces that now challenged creatures whose lifespans were measured in mere decades. The entry point for most of the Garcane migration was the Duchy of Toussaint, a land that would become forever marked by their presence, even though most of its human inhabitants remained blissfully unaware of the significance of what had occurred in their territory. The dimensional rift that had allowed passage from the vampire realm had opened somewhere in the rolling hills and ancient forests of that region, though its exact location would be hidden so thoroughly that centuries later, even the most dedicated scholars would be unable to locate it with certainty. The vampires who stepped through that portal into their new world found themselves in a landscape that was breathtakingly beautiful but utterly alien to their sensibilities. Where their home realm had been shaped by eons of vampire civilization, this new world bore the marks of shorter-lived but no less determined intelligent species. Human settlements dotted the countryside, their architecture reflecting building traditions that had developed over mere centuries rather than the millennia that vampire construction required. The very air carried scents and sounds that spoke of biological processes and natural cycles that operated on timescales foreign to immortal experience. But perhaps most challenging of all was the realization that they were no longer the dominant intelligence in their environment. The humans, elves, and other races that populated this world were not cattle to be managed or subjects to be ruled, but independent beings with their own cultures, their own goals, and their own claims to the territory that the vampires now sought to inhabit. The philosophical commitment to coexistence that had motivated the Garcane's choice of destination would be tested immediately by the practical realities of sharing space with creatures who viewed them, quite reasonably, as potential threats. The early years of vampire settlement in Toussaint were marked by cautious exploration and careful observation as the new arrivals attempted to understand the world they had chosen to call home. Ancient strongholds were established in remote locations, places where vampires could gather in safety while they developed strategies for long-term survival in their alien environment. Teshem Mutna, built into mountain caves that offered both security and concealment, became the most significant of these early settlements, a place where vampire culture could be preserved and adapted for the challenges of their new existence. The construction of Teshem Mutna represented both the vampires' determination to maintain their identity and their recognition that fundamental changes would be necessary for survival. The stronghold was designed according to vampire architectural principles that emphasized permanence and grandeur on scales that human builders could barely comprehend, but it also incorporated features that reflected their new circumstances. Defensive measures were included not because vampires feared military attack, but because they understood that their presence in this world would inevitably attract attention from beings who might not share their philosophical commitment to peaceful coexistence. The magical and technological innovations that the vampires developed during this period of adjustment reflected their unique position as immortal beings adapting to mortal world. Blood-activated locks and mechanisms ensured that their strongholds could only be accessed by members of their own race, while sophisticated alchemical processes allowed them to create weapons and armor that incorporated materials and techniques unknown to the other inhabitants of their new world. The Teshem Mutna armor and weapons that would be discovered centuries later bore witness to craftsmanship that combined vampire ingenuity with resources available only in their adopted realm. But even as they worked to establish secure bases of operation, even as they developed new technologies and techniques for survival in an alien world, the vampires were beginning to grapple with questions that would define their existence for centuries to come. How could beings accustomed to thinking in terms of millennia adapt to a world where change occurred within the span of single lifetimes? How could immortals who had never known scarcity or competition learn to share resources with creatures whose entire existence was shaped by the knowledge of their own mortality? How could vampires maintain their essential nature while adapting to circumstances that their evolution had never prepared them to face? The answers to these questions would not come easily or quickly, and the path toward integration would be marked by mistakes and misunderstandings that would haunt vampire-human relations for generations. But in those early years after the conjunction, as the Garcane worked to establish their presence in Toussaint and the surrounding regions, there was still hope that their philosophical commitment to coexistence might provide the foundation for a future where vampires and mortals could share the world in something approaching harmony. The ancient glyphs that the early vampire settlers carved into the stones of Teshem Mutna, symbols that would endure long after their creators had dispersed across the continent, bore witness to their determination to honor their origins while embracing their new destiny. Coated in blood according to traditions that stretched back to the dawn of vampire civilization, these markings served as reminders of where the Garcane had come from, and waypoints for those who might one day wish to trace the paths that had led them to their new home. They were monuments to a great migration, markers of the moment when an ancient race had chosen exile over extinction and committed themselves to learning what it might mean to be immortal in a world of mortals. The transformation that would reshape both vampires and their adopted world had begun, though none who witnessed those early days could have imagined the complexity of the relationship that would eventually develop between these alien immortals and the shorter-lived races among whom they had chosen to make their life a home. The Garcane had come to the continent as refugees from cosmic catastrophe, but they would remain as something far more complex, beings whose very existence would challenge every assumption about the nature of life, death, and what it truly meant to be human. To understand the true nature of higher vampires, one must first abandon every assumption that mortal minds have constructed about the boundaries between life and death, between existence and extinction, between the possible and the impossible. For in the realm of these ancient beings, such distinctions become meaningless, replaced by concepts so alien to human experience that even the most learned scholars struggle to comprehend their implications. The immortality possessed by higher vampires is not simply an extension of mortal life, not merely the absence of natural death, but something far more profound and disturbing, a fundamental restructuring of what it means to exist at all. When mortals speak of death, they refer to a cessation that is both final and absolute, the moment when consciousness departs and flesh begins its inevitable decay. Even the most optimistic beliefs about afterlives or spiritual continuation acknowledge that something essential has ended, that the person who once lived and breathed and thought is gone forever, leaving behind only memories and perhaps some intangible essence that bears little resemblance to their original form. Death, for mortals, represents the ultimate boundary, the one experience that cannot be undone or reversed regardless of wealth or power or desperate determination. Higher vampires exist beyond such limitations, their consciousness and identity preserved through transformations that would utterly annihilate any other form of life. Their matter, as one of their kind would later explain with clinical detachment, can exist without the structures that other creatures require for survival. Hearts may be torn from their chests, brains may be scattered to the winds, lungs may be filled with molten metal, and yet the essential spark that defines their existence continues, waiting with patient inevitability for the slow process of regeneration to restore what has been lost. This fundamental difference in biology creates implications that extend far beyond simple questions of durability or longevity, where mortals must carefully protect their physical forms, knowing that significant damage may prove irreversible or fatal. Higher vampires can afford to take risks and make sacrifices that would be unthinkable for any other intelligent species. They can explore the depths of the ocean without concern for drowning, venture into the heart of volcanic eruptions without fear of burning, or subject themselves to experimental procedures that would kill ordinary beings instantly. Their relationship with pain and suffering is necessarily different from that of creatures whose existence might end at any moment. The process of regeneration itself varies dramatically depending on the extent of damage sustained and the circumstances surrounding the vampire's destruction. A higher vampire who suffers conventional death, the kind that might result from sword wounds or magical assault, typically requires decades to restore their physical form from whatever fragments remain. The consciousness persists throughout this process, aware but unable to act, experiencing what survivors have described as an eternity of cold darkness punctuated by gradual sensations as tissue slowly knits itself back together and organs gradually resume their function. But even more catastrophic destruction need not prove permanent for beings whose existence transcends the merely physical. Regis's experience during the assault on Stigger Castle provided a detailed case study in the extremes of vampire regeneration when he was literally melted into glass by the sorcerer Vilgefortz's magical assault. The process that reduced him to a shapeless smear of crystallized matter should have been sufficient to destroy any other form of life completely, yet his consciousness somehow survived even this ultimate violation of biological integrity. The recovery from such total physical destruction required assistance from another of his kind, a process that shortened his regeneration time from what might have been centuries to a mere 8 years. Detlef's sacrifice of his own blood to aid in Regis's restoration demonstrated both the bonds that could exist between vampires and the unique properties of their vital essence. Unlike the blood of mortal creatures, which serves primarily as a transport medium for oxygen and nutrients, vampire blood appears to carry information and energy that can facilitate the reconstruction of completely destroyed tissue and organs. The psychological experience of regeneration, according to those few vampires who have discussed it openly, involves sensations and states of consciousness for which human language has no adequate terms. Regis spoke of drowning in icy terror, of experiencing a cold so profound that it seemed to freeze not just his reconstructing flesh, but the very essence of his being. The metaphor of frost and winter that he employed was not merely poetic description, but an attempt to convey something that transcended normal sensory experience, a state of existence that combined awareness with absolute helplessness in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of consciousness itself. This relationship with death and resurrection creates psychological pressures that no mortal mind has ever been forced to endure. Humans fear death precisely because they understand it to be final, and this fear motivates much of their behavior, driving them to seek safety, to form alliances, to create meaning within the limited time they have been granted. But higher vampires must exist with the knowledge that no action they take, no enemy they face, can truly end their existence unless another of their own kind chooses to make it so. This knowledge profoundly shapes their approach to risk, to relationships, and to the very question of what makes existence worthwhile. The immortality of higher vampires extends beyond mere physical indestructibility to encompass abilities that blur the line between biology and magic. Their capacity for shape-shifting allows them to assume forms ranging from human appearance to monstrous configurations that reflect their true nature, transformations that are not mere illusions, but actual physical restructuring on a cellular level. A higher vampire, assuming human form, does not simply disguise their appearance, but temporarily reorganizes their entire physiology to match the expected patterns of mortal biology, complete with heartbeat, breathing, and body temperature that can fool even sophisticated magical detection. The mist form that many higher vampires can assume represents perhaps their most alien ability, a state of existence that challenges basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical form. In this state, they retain their awareness and intelligence while their matter disperses into particles so fine that they can pass through the smallest openings or flow around obstacles that would impede any solid creature. The transition between solid and gaseous states appears to be accomplished through conscious will rather than external magical influence, suggesting that their control over their own physical composition operates according to principles that mortal science cannot explain. The enhanced senses possessed by higher vampires provide them with awareness of their environment that far exceeds anything available to other intelligent species. Their ability to detect heartbeats from great distances, to track scents across terrain that would confound even the most skilled hunters, to perceive magical emanations invisible to ordinary sight, all combine to create a sensory experience of the world that is fundamentally different from that of mortals. They exist in a reality where information flows constantly from every direction, where the emotional states of nearby creatures can be detected through subtle changes in scent and sound, where the very air carries messages about events occurring miles away. But perhaps most significant for understanding higher vampire psychology is their relationship with blood, the substance that serves as both sustenance and addiction for their kind. Unlike the simple nutritional requirements that drive mortal creatures to seek food, the vampire's need for blood operates on levels that combine physical nourishment with psychological compulsion. The consumption of blood provides not just energy, but experiences that no other substance can offer, sensations that combine taste and intoxication with something approaching mystical revelation. The parallel between vampire blood drinking and mortal alcoholism, while imperfect, provides some insight into the challenges that these beings face in attempting to integrate into human society. A vampire who has tasted human blood experiences, pleasures, and insights that nothing else can provide, creating cravings that persist for centuries after the last feeding. The decision to abstain from blood consumption, as Regis eventually chose to do, requires a level of sustained willpower that few mortals could maintain for even a fraction of a vampire's lifespan. The process of blood abstinence for a higher vampire involves more than simple self-denial, extending to fundamental changes in behavior and consciousness that affect every aspect of their existence. The savage fury that blood consumption can induce, the loss of rational control that transforms sophisticated beings into feral predators, represents not merely a temporary loss of composure, but a reversion to more primitive aspects of vampire nature that civilization has struggled to suppress. A vampire who chooses abstinence must constantly guard against not just the temptation to feed, but the deeper impulse to surrender to the bestial aspects of their own psychology. The enhanced physical capabilities that higher vampires possess create additional complications for their attempts to blend into mortal society. Strength that can crush stone, speed that makes human movement appear sluggish, reflexes that can respond to threats faster than mortal eyes can track. All must be carefully controlled and concealed whenever they interact with other intelligent beings. The constant effort required to appear normal, to move and react within the expected parameters of human ability, represents a burden that few mortals can appreciate, a performance that must be maintained without error for decades or centuries at a time. The immunity to diseases and toxins that affects mortal creatures provides higher vampires with protection against threats that would devastate human populations, but it also sets them apart in ways that careful observers might detect. They cannot fall ill with the plagues that sweep through cities, cannot be poisoned by substances that would kill ordinary beings within hours, cannot suffer the gradual deterioration that age brings to mortal flesh. While these immunities represent obvious advantages, they also create the constant risk of exposure for vampires attempting to maintain human identities over extended periods. The sterility that affects most higher vampires represents perhaps their greatest sacrifice in the transformation that granted them immortality. The ability to create new life, to participate in the biological continuity that defines existence for mortal creatures has been traded away in exchange for their own deathless persistence. This loss creates psychological wounds that never fully heal, contributing to the isolation and alienation that characterizes so much of vampire existence. They can witness the birth and growth and eventual death of countless generations of mortals, but they cannot participate in the fundamental process that gives meaning to so much of biological existence. The magical nature of higher vampire physiology creates additional complexities that distinguish them from both living and undead creatures. Their resistance to magical attacks and their ability to manipulate supernatural forces suggest that their existence operates partially outside the normal boundaries of physical law. Yet, unlike creatures that are purely magical in origin, vampires retain clear connections to biological processes, requiring sustenance and responding to physical stimuli in ways that purely spiritual beings do not. They exist in a liminal space between the material and ethereal realms, neither fully one nor the other, but something entirely unique in their hybrid nature. The psychological burden of true immortality cannot be understood without considering the weight of memory that these beings must carry. A vampire who has existed for centuries possesses not just knowledge of past events, but vivid recollections of experiences that span multiple human generations. They remember not just historical facts, but the sensory details of conversations with people who have been dead for decades, the taste of wines from vineyards that no longer exist, the scent of flowers from gardens that have long since returned to wilderness. This accumulation of memory creates both wisdom and torment, providing perspective that no mortal can achieve while also burdening consciousness with losses and regrets that can never be resolved. The relationship between higher vampires and their own emotions represents another area where their alien nature becomes apparent. The training and conditioning that many undergo to suppress their natural responses to blood and violence necessarily affects their capacity for other forms of feeling as well. The emotional numbness that some vampires cultivate as a survival mechanism can extend to all areas of experience, creating beings whose intellectual capabilities remain intact while their capacity for joy, love, or simple contentment gradually withers away. The question of whether vampires can truly feel emotions as mortals do remains open to debate, but the evidence suggests that their responses are at least significantly altered by the psychological pressures of their existence. The social isolation that results from vampire nature creates additional psychological pressures that compound the other challenges of immortal existence. The need to maintain false identities, to conceal their true nature from everyone around them, to constantly guard against revealing their supernatural abilities or knowledge, creates a barrier between vampires and other intelligent beings that can never be completely overcome. Even vampires who genuinely care for mortal friends must always hold part of themselves in reserve, knowing that complete honesty about their nature would likely destroy the relationships they have worked so carefully to build. The prospect of eternity stretching ahead without hope of natural ending creates existential challenges that mortal minds struggle to comprehend. Human existence, for all its difficulties, carries the knowledge that suffering is temporary, that pain and loss and disappointment will eventually be ended by death if nothing else. But higher vampires must confront the possibility that their current circumstances, whatever they might be, could persist for millennia without change or resolution. This knowledge can lead to a kind of philosophical paralysis, an inability to commit to any course of action when the consequences must be lived with for potentially endless time. Yet within these profound challenges and limitations, some higher vampires have discovered possibilities for growth and meaning that transcend the mere accumulation of years. Regis's journey from blood-drunk predator to compassionate healer demonstrates that even beings whose nature seems fixed and immutable can choose transformation and development. His decision to swear off blood consumption and dedicate himself to helping rather than harming mortals represents not just personal growth, but proof that vampire nature need not determine vampire choices. The capacity for moral development, for choosing to become something better than what one was created to be, may represent the most human aspect of these decidedly non-human beings. The immortality of higher vampires is thus revealed to be not the simple blessing that mortal imaginations often portray it as, but a complex condition that brings both extraordinary capabilities and unprecedented burdens. These beings exist beyond the normal boundaries of life and death, but they do not exist beyond the reach of suffering or the need for meaning and connection. Their alien nature makes them fundamentally different from the mortals among whom they live, but it does not exempt them from the deeper questions that consciousness inevitably poses. In their struggles to find purpose and peace within their deathless existence, higher vampires reveal truths about the nature of being that extend far beyond the boundaries of their own supernatural condition. The society that emerged among the higher vampires following their settlement in the New World was unlike any form of civilization that mortals had ever conceived or could easily comprehend. Built upon foundations of immortality, supernatural power, and memories that stretched back across centuries, vampire culture developed according to principles that reflected both their alien origins and the unique challenges they faced as refugees attempting to adapt to a realm dominated by shorter-lived species. The laws that governed their interactions, the hierarchies that determined their relationships, and the customs that defined their collective identity all served purposes that extended far beyond simple social organization into the realm of species survival itself. Central to every aspect of higher vampire society was the sacred prohibition against vampire-on-vampire violence, a law so fundamental that its violation represented not merely a crime, but a form of blasphemy that struck at the very heart of what it meant to be vampire. This prohibition emerged from practical necessity as much as moral principle, born from the recognition that beings capable of permanent mutual destruction must find ways to resolve their conflicts that did not risk the ultimate penalty. When any higher vampire could kill another permanently with the right application of force, when no external authority possessed sufficient power to intervene in such conflicts, the species as a whole depended upon internal restraints that were more absolute than any mortal law. The reasoning behind this prohibition extended beyond simple self-preservation to encompass deeper philosophical questions about the nature of immortal existence. Higher vampires, unlike mortal beings whose individual deaths represented tragedy but not species-threatening catastrophe, could not afford to lose even a single member of their already diminished population. Each vampire represented centuries or millennia of accumulated knowledge, experience, and cultural memory that could never be replaced once lost. The death of a higher vampire meant not just the end of an individual consciousness, but the permanent erasure of everything that being had learned and achieved across their extended existence. The enforcement of this sacred law required no external authority because its violation carried consequences that extended far beyond any punishment that could be imposed by vampire society. A vampire who killed another of their kind became immediately and permanently cut off from all contact with their own species, branded as a betrayer whose very existence represented a threat to the survival of all vampires. The isolation that followed such an act was not merely social ostracism, but complete exile from the only community that could truly understand the burdens and challenges of immortal existence. For beings whose alien nature already set them apart from every other form of intelligent life, such total rejection represented a form of living death that many considered worse than physical destruction. The hierarchical structure that developed within vampire society reflected both their origins in the ancient tribal divisions and the realities of power distribution that had emerged during their adaptation to the New World. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the unseen elders, being so ancient and powerful that they transcended the normal categories of vampire existence and functioned more as forces of nature than as individuals with recognizable personalities or motivations. These creatures, perhaps a dozen in total across the entire world, represented the ultimate evolution of vampire capabilities, beings who had lived for so long and accumulated so much power that they had moved beyond the need or desire for normal social interaction. The unseen elders served as both the ultimate arbiters of vampire lore and the guardians of the most sacred sites and artifacts that connected their species to its origins. Each elder claimed dominion over vast territories that often encompassed multiple human kingdoms, though their rule was exercised so subtly that the mortal inhabitants of these regions remained completely unaware of their true sovereignty. The elders communicated among themselves through methods that lesser vampires could not comprehend, maintaining a network of influence and authority that spanned continents while remaining invisible to all external observation. Below the elders in the vampire hierarchy were the ancient vampires who had achieved positions of respect and influence through centuries of survival and accomplishment. These beings, while still subject to the ultimate authority of the unseen elders, functioned as the effective rulers of vampire society in their respective regions. They established and maintained the strongholds where vampires could gather safely, organized the resource networks that allowed their kind to survive without attracting unwanted attention from mortals, and served as teachers and mentors for younger members of their species who were still learning to navigate the complexities of existence in an alien world. The tribal affiliations that had defined vampire society in their original realm continued to influence relationships and alliances even after the Great Migration, though these ancient divisions had been modified by the shared experience of exile and adaptation. The Garcane tribe, having chosen to remain and integrate with the mortals of this world, had developed into numerous smaller clans and family groups that maintained loose connections while adapting to local circumstances. These regional variations in vampire culture reflected both the vast distances that separated different vampire communities and the influence of the mortal societies among which they lived. The technology and craftsmanship that higher vampires developed during their early centuries in the New World demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded anything achieved by mortal civilizations. Working with materials and techniques that combined their ancient knowledge with resources available only in their adopted realm, vampire artificers created weapons and armor that incorporated properties unknown to human metallurgy. The blood-activated mechanisms that secured their strongholds represented innovations in magical engineering that required deep understanding of both supernatural forces and practical engineering principles. The creation of these technological marvels was not merely a matter of practical necessity, but served important cultural functions within vampire society. The act of crafting weapons or armor, according to ancient traditions, helped maintain connections to their origins while adapting those traditions to new circumstances. The finished products served as symbols of status and achievement within vampire hierarchies, markers of the skill and dedication required to master techniques that might take decades to perfect. Most importantly, these artifacts served as repositories of vampire knowledge and culture, physical objects that could preserve important information and traditions for future generations. The most significant example of vampire architectural achievement was the fortress of Teshem Mutna, a stronghold that served multiple functions within their society while remaining completely hidden from mortal awareness. Built into mountain caves that offered both natural protection and concealment, the fortress represented the perfect fusion of vampire architectural principles with the defensive requirements of their new circumstances. The structure incorporated features that would have been impossible to create using mortal techniques, including chambers whose dimensions defied normal geometric principles and passages that connected to other locations through means that transcended ordinary space. The transformation of Teshem Mutna from simple refuge to complex research facility reflected the evolution of vampire society as they adapted to their new environment. The early chambers had been designed according to traditional architectural principles that emphasize grandeur and permanence, spaces meant to house vampire nobility in circumstances befitting their status and accomplishments. But as the challenges of coexistence with mortals became apparent, additional facilities were constructed to serve more specialized purposes that reflected the unique problems faced by immortal refugees in a mortal world. The development of these specialized facilities brought with it the need for new forms of vampire law and custom that addressed situations their ancient traditions had never contemplated. The question of how to interact with mortal beings, how to obtain necessary resources without attracting unwanted attention, how to deal with vampires whose behavior threatened the safety and secrecy of the entire community, all required solutions that went beyond the traditional structures of vampire authority. New laws were developed through consensus among the elder vampires, while enforcement mechanisms were established that could function effectively in circumstances their ancestors had never imagined. The case of Cogmore represented the first major test of these new legal structures and demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of vampire justice. The ancient vampire, whose bloodlust had grown beyond all reasonable bounds, posed a threat not just to mortal populations but to the entire vampire community, whose safety depended upon maintaining secrecy and avoiding actions that would provoke organized resistance from human authorities. The decision to capture and imprison Cogmore rather than killing him outright reflected both the sacred prohibition against vampire-on-vampire violence and the recognition that his crimes required punishment more severe than bow, simple exile, or social ostracism. The construction of Cogmore's prison within the depths of Teshem Mutna required innovations in both magical and mundane engineering that pushed vampire capabilities to their limits. The cage that was created to hold him combined materials from multiple realms, incorporating silver and dimeritium and meteorite steel in alloys that had never been attempted before. The result was a containment system that could withstand not just physical assault but magical attacks that might have breached any conventional barrier. Most importantly, the prison was designed to torment its occupant psychologically as well as physically. Using his own enhanced senses and supernatural capabilities against him in ways that ensured his suffering would continue for centuries. The choice to preserve Cogmore's life while subjecting him to eternal torment reflected philosophical principles within vampire society that valued both justice and the preservation of their diminishing population. Death would have been simpler and perhaps more merciful, but it would also have represented a permanent loss of vampire consciousness and knowledge that the community could not afford. Instead, the imprisonment served multiple purposes, punishing the criminal while preserving his potential for future redemption and maintaining him as an example to other vampires who might be tempted towards similar excesses. The psychological effects of Cogmore's punishment extended far beyond its intended target to influence the behavior and attitudes of vampires throughout their society. The knowledge that such extreme measures could be taken against those who violated community standards served as a powerful deterrent to others who might otherwise have indulged their more destructive impulses. But it also created an atmosphere of watchfulness and mutual surveillance that changed the nature of vampire social relationships, introducing elements of fear and suspicion into communities that had previously operated on principles of trust and mutual respect. The creation of the torture chamber and the systematic use of human suffering to torment Cogmore revealed aspects of vampire nature that even they found disturbing upon later reflection. The clinical precision with which human prisoners were made to suffer, the careful calibration of pain and terror to achieve maximum psychological impact on the imprisoned vampire, demonstrated capabilities for cruelty that went beyond simple predatory behavior into realms of deliberate sadism. The vampires who designed and operated these systems were not driven by hatred or personal animosity, but by cold calculation about the most effective methods for achieving their goals. The gradual abandonment of these extreme measures as vampire society matured reflected both changing attitudes toward mortal beings and growing recognition that such methods were inconsistent with their stated goals of peaceful coexistence. The vampires who had arrived as refugees seeking sanctuary eventually came to understand that their treatment of mortals would inevitably influence their own moral development and social cohesion. The choice to develop more ethical approaches to necessary functions like resource acquisition and population control represented genuine moral growth rather than mere practical adaptation. The development of the code known as out of sight, out of mind represented perhaps the most practical solution to the challenges of maintaining vampire society across vast distances and diverse circumstances. This principle recognized that vampires scattered across continents and living under radically different conditions could not be held to uniform standards of behavior or association. Instead, the code established that vampires who kept their activities private and avoided actions that threatened the broader community would be left alone to manage their own affairs according to their individual circumstances and preferences. This principle of selective oversight allowed vampire society to accommodate enormous diversity in lifestyle and philosophy while maintaining the essential bonds that held their species together. A vampire who chose to live in complete isolation, avoiding all contact with both mortals and other vampires, would be respected for that choice as long as their actions did not create problems for other members of their species. Similarly, vampires who chose to integrate deeply into mortal society, perhaps even forming genuine friendships and romantic relationships with humans, could do so without interference, as long as they maintained appropriate secrecy about their true nature. The wisdom of this approach became apparent over the centuries as vampire communities adapted to widely varying local conditions and cultural influences. Vampires living in the sophisticated urban centers of the northern kingdoms developed very different social strategies than those who made their homes in the rural territories of Nilfgaard or the wild frontier regions beyond the Pontar Valley. The out of sight, out of mind principle allowed each community to develop approaches that worked in their specific circumstances while preserving the broader unity that their species required for long-term survival. The enforcement of vampire law under this system required subtle methods that could operate effectively without creating the kind of visible authority structures that might attract unwanted attention from mortal observers. Elder vampires in each region took responsibility for monitoring the behavior of their younger colleagues, intervening when necessary to prevent actions that might threaten community security, but otherwise allowing considerable autonomy in personal choices. Communication networks were established that could rapidly spread information about threats or opportunities across vampire communities, while maintaining the secrecy that their survival required. The rare cases where more direct intervention became necessary were handled with efficiency and discretion that reflected centuries of experience in managing supernatural conflicts. Vampires whose behavior posed genuine threats to community safety might find themselves facing coordinated pressure from multiple elders, subtle manipulations that gradually convinced them to modify their conduct or relocate to areas where their presence would be less problematic. In extreme cases, the threat of complete social isolation proved sufficient to bring even the most rebellious vampires back into line with community expectations. The success of vampire society in maintaining its coherence and security over multiple centuries while remaining completely hidden from mortal authorities represented an achievement in social organization that had few parallels in the Duthri Benjus history of any species. The combination of ancient wisdom and practical adaptation that characterized their approach to governance provided stability and continuity while allowing sufficient flexibility to accommodate changing circumstances and individual big differences. The laws and customs that emerged from this process reflected both their alien origins and their growing understanding of the world they had chosen to inhabit. Yet beneath the apparent success of vampire social organization lay tensions and contradictions that would eventually challenge the stability of their carefully constructed communities. The fundamental conflict between their nature as predators and their stated commitment to peaceful coexistence created psychological pressures that no amount of law or custom could entirely resolve. The isolation required by their need for secrecy conflicted with their social instincts and their desire for meaningful relationships. The accumulation of power and knowledge over centuries created disparities within vampire society that threatened the equality and mutual respect upon which their laws were based. The unseen elders, whose authority provided the ultimate foundation for vampire society, remained enigmatic figures whose motivations and long-term goals were unclear even to other vampires. Their immense age and power had transformed them into beings so alien that normal social relationships became impossible, creating a leadership structure based more on fear and incomprehension than on genuine consent or shared purpose. The question of whether these ancient creatures truly served the interests of vampire society as a whole or pursued agendas comprehensible only to their transformed consciousness remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The artifacts and strongholds that vampires had created during their early centuries of settlement served as repositories of their culture and knowledge, but also as potential vulnerabilities that could expose their existence to hostile forces. The magical technologies they had developed, while providing significant advantages in their daily lives, also created dependencies that might prove difficult to maintain as circumstances changed. The very success of their integration into mortal society created new forms of risk as individual vampires formed attachments and commitments that might conflict with the broader needs of their species. As vampire society matured and evolved in response to changing conditions in the mortal world around them, the ancient laws and customs that had served them well during their early centuries of exile would face new challenges that tested their fundamental assumptions about identity, loyalty, and survival. The immortals who had created a hidden civilization within a mortal world would discover that even the most carefully constructed social structures could not eliminate the contradictions inherent in their existence. The Society of Immortals had achieved remarkable stability and success, but it remained vulnerable to forces both internal and external that would eventually force them to confront the deeper questions about what it truly meant to be vampire in a world that neither understood nor accepted their true nature. The darkest chapter in the history of higher vampire civilization began not with malicious intent or conscious cruelty, but with the cold application of scientific methodology to problems that should never have been subjected to such dispassionate analysis. In the centuries following their arrival in the New World, as vampire communities struggled to establish sustainable ways of existing alongside mortal populations, some among their kind began to approach the question of human interaction not as a moral challenge requiring wisdom and restraint, but as a technical problem demanding systematic study and optimization. The transformation of Teshem Mutna from a simple stronghold into a center for what the vampires termed research reflected a fundamental shift in how at least some members of their species viewed the mortals among whom they lived. Where the early refugees had seen humans as fellow intelligent beings deserving of respect despite their obvious limitations, these researchers began to regard them as subjects for investigation, creatures whose behavior and biology could be studied and manipulated in service of vampire needs. The philosophical implications of this change would not become fully apparent until generations later, but the practical consequences began to manifest almost immediately in modifications to the fortress that revealed disturbing new priorities. The construction of specialized chambers deep within the mountain caves marked the beginning of systematic human captivity on a scale that dwarfed anything that individual vampires had attempted during their early years of adaptation. Where previous interactions between vampires and humans had been limited by practical constraints of secrecy and the physical impossibility of managing large numbers of prisoners, the resources and security offered by Teshem Mutna allowed for experiments that required sustained observation over extended periods. The chambers that were carved from living rock during this period were designed not for comfort or humane treatment, but for efficiency in managing human livestock under controlled conditions. The vampires who initiated these programs approached their work with the same methodical precision that characterized all aspects of their ancient culture, applying intellectual rigor and systematic observation to questions that revealed the depths of their alienation from mortal concerns. The book that would later be discovered among the fortress archives, titled Human Husbandry and Care, represented the culmination of decades of research into the optimal methods for managing human populations as renewable resources. The clinical language used throughout the text, its matter-of-fact discussions of breeding programs and feeding schedules, demonstrated how completely its authors had divorced themselves from any recognition of human dignity or suffering. The research methodology employed by these vampire scientists reflected both their immortal perspective and their fundamentally alien psychology in ways that made their conclusions all the more disturbing for their apparent reasonableness. Unlike mortal researchers whose work was constrained by limited lifespans and ethical considerations, vampire investigators could conduct studies that spanned multiple human generations, observing the long-term effects of various environmental and social factors on human development and behavior. Their findings, preserved in meticulous records that treated human subjects with the same detachment typically reserved for laboratory animals, provided insights into human nature that were as scientifically valuable as they were morally horrifying. The discovery that humans produced higher quality blood when allowed apparent freedom represented a breakthrough that fundamentally altered vampire approaches to resource management while creating new categories of ethical compromise. The researchers had determined through careful experimentation that stress and confinement affected human blood chemistry in ways that reduced its nutritional value and psychological effects for vampire consumers. This finding led to the development of what they termed free-range human management, a system that provided subjects with comfortable living conditions and apparent autonomy while maintaining subtle but complete control over their lives and eventual fate. The implementation of free-range human farming required innovations in psychological manipulation and social engineering that demonstrated vampire capabilities in areas far removed from their traditional strengths in combat and individual survival. The humans who were selected for these programs were provided with housing, food, and social opportunities that far exceeded what most of their contemporaries could expect from normal life, creating the illusion of privilege and security that made their actual circumstances bearable. The careful attention paid to their emotional and physical well-being served purposes that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with optimizing the quality of their blood for eventual consumption. The psychological studies that accompanied these breeding programs revealed the extent to which vampire researchers had penetrated the mysteries of human consciousness and emotion in service of goals that treated such understanding as mere technical knowledge. The conversations recorded between Master Ezekiel and his human subjects provided disturbing evidence of intellectual curiosity applied to questions that should have been approached with empathy and respect rather than clinical detachment. The vampire researcher's genuine puzzlement about the nature of fear and pain demonstrated not ignorance but a form of emotional blindness that allowed him to inflict suffering while remaining intellectually engaged with its mechanisms. The systematic exploration of human emotional responses through controlled experiments that deliberately induced terror, despair, and hopelessness represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of vampire research methodology. The subjects of these experiments were not anonymous victims, but individuals whose names and personal histories were meticulously recorded, alongside detailed observations of their psychological deterioration under various forms of stress. The researchers approached the destruction of human minds with the same careful attention to methodology that characterized their studies of blood chemistry and breeding patterns, treating consciousness itself as a phenomenon to be dissected and analyzed. The development of specialized facilities for different aspects of human management reflected both the scale of these operations and the degree of organizational sophistication that vampire society had achieved during its hidden existence. The battery cages that lined certain sections of the fortress were designed for efficient management of large numbers of humans in minimal space, their construction incorporating features that addressed every aspect of captive human needs while prioritizing vampire convenience over subject comfort. The contrast between these cramped enclosures and the spacious chambers reserved for free-range subjects illustrated the researchers' understanding that different experimental purposes required different environmental conditions. The architectural innovations required to support these expanded research programs demonstrated vampire engineering capabilities that far exceeded anything achieved by contemporary mortal civilizations. The ventilation systems that maintained air quality in crowded chambers, the drainage networks that managed waste from hundreds of human subjects, the mechanisms that delivered food and water while minimizing contact between captives and their captors, all represented technical achievements that would have been impossible using available human knowledge and techniques. The fact that such sophisticated infrastructure was dedicated to purposes that served no goal beyond vampire convenience highlighted the moral blindness that had infected portions of their society. The breeding programs that were developed to ensure sustainable supplies of human subjects represented the ultimate expression of vampire researchers' view of mortals as renewable resources rather than intelligent beings deserving of moral consideration. The careful selection of breeding pairs based on factors that included blood quality, physical health, intelligence, and emotional stability reflected decades of observation and experimentation designed to optimize offspring according to vampire preferences. The records of these programs, maintained with the same attention to detail that characterized all vampire scholarship, documented the systematic reduction of human beings to genetic material valued only for its utility to their captors. The generational studies that tracked human subjects from birth to death provided vampire researchers with unprecedented insights into mortal development and behavior, while simultaneously demonstrating the complete erosion of empathy that NT characterized their approach to other intelligent beings. Children born into captivity were subjected to various experimental conditions designed to determine optimal management strategies, their entire lives serving as data points in studies that treated their suffering as acceptable costs of scientific advancement. The researchers who conducted these studies recorded their observations with meticulous care, while remaining apparently oblivious to the horror of their actions. The psychological profiles that were developed of human subjects revealed both the sophistication of vampire understanding of mortal psychology and the uses to which such knowledge was applied. The categories developed to classify different types of human responses to captivity, the techniques devised for managing resistance and maintaining cooperation, the methods created for inducing specific emotional states on demand, all demonstrated capabilities that would have represented remarkable achievements in the study of consciousness if they had been applied for purposes other than exploitation and control. The gradual expansion of these research programs from simple resource management to comprehensive studies of human nature reflected the intellectual curiosity that characterized vampire culture even when directed toward morally indefensible goals. The researchers who had begun with practical questions about feeding and housing human subjects gradually developed broader interests in human behavior, emotion, and social organization that led them to conduct experiments with no purpose beyond satisfying their scientific curiosity. The humans who became subjects of these expanded studies were valued not even as resources, but as specimens whose suffering provided data for investigations that served no practical vampire needs. The documentation of experimental procedures that deliberately inflicted maximum psychological trauma while maintaining subjects in physically viable condition demonstrated the clinical precision with which vampire researchers approached the systematic destruction of human dignity and hope. The techniques that were developed for inducing specific forms of emotional breakdown, the protocols established for maintaining subjects in states of chronic fear or despair, the procedures designed for studying human responses to witnessing the suffering of loved ones, all represented innovations in the science of inflicting suffering that reflected both intellectual sophistication and complete moral vacancy. The collaboration between different vampire researchers in designing and implementing these programs revealed the extent to which portions of vampire society had become complicit in activities that violated every principle of ethical behavior toward other intelligent beings. The sharing of techniques and findings among investigators, the coordination of experiments across different facilities, the development of standardized procedures for managing human subjects, all demonstrated that these activities were not the work of isolated individuals but represented systematic policies endorsed and supported by vampire authorities. The economic systems that developed around human farming operations reflected the integration of these activities into the broader structure of vampire society in ways that implicated even those vampires who did not participate directly in research activities. The distribution networks that delivered human blood to vampire communities throughout the region, the trading relationships that exchanged human subjects for other resources, the financial arrangements that supported continued expansion of research facilities, all created webs of complicity that extended far beyond the researchers who conducted the actual experiments. The technological innovations that were developed specifically for managing large-scale human captivity demonstrated vampire capabilities that combined their ancient knowledge with resources available only in their adopted world. The alchemical processes used to preserve blood for extended storage, the magical techniques employed to monitor human subjects without physical supervision, the mechanical devices created for automated feeding and waste management, all represented applications of vampire intelligence and creativity to purposes that served their convenience while ignoring the suffering such efficiency required. The gradual recognition among some vampires that these research programs represented moral failures rather than scientific achievements marked the beginning of internal conflicts within vampire society that would eventually lead to significant changes in their approaches to human interaction. The vampires who began to question the ethics of treating humans as laboratory animals faced resistance from colleagues who viewed such concerns as irrelevant sentimentality that threatened valuable research opportunities. These philosophical divisions would eventually contribute to the abandonment of large-scale human farming, though not before countless human lives had been destroyed in service of vampire curiosity and convenience. The documentation that survived from this period in vampire history provided evidence of systematic dehumanization on a scale that challenged comprehension while serving as a reminder of the depths to which even sophisticated civilizations could descend when they abandoned moral constraints in pursuit of practical advantages. The careful records maintained by vampire researchers, their detailed observations of human suffering, their clinical discussions of techniques for maximizing despair while maintaining physical viability, all testified to the capacity of intelligence without empathy to create horrors that exceeded anything produced by simple cruelty or ignorance. The eventual transition away from systematic human farming toward more sustainable approaches to coexistence reflected both practical considerations and genuine moral development within vampire society, though the process was gradual and incomplete. The recognition that large-scale captivity of humans created security risks that threatened vampire secrecy, combined with growing awareness among some vampires that their treatment of mortals was fundamentally inconsistent with their stated goals of peaceful coexistence. The reforms that eventually eliminated the worst abuses of the research programs represented genuine progress, though they could not undo the suffering that had been inflicted or restore the lives that had been destroyed. The legacy of this dark period in vampire history continued to influence human-vampire relationships for centuries after the abandonment of systematic farming operations, creating foundations of mistrust and fear that would prove difficult to overcome, even when individual vampires demonstrated genuine commitment to ethical behavior. The knowledge that their species was capable of such systematic cruelty, that their intellectual capabilities could be applied to such morally indefensible purposes, would haunt even those vampires who had never participated in or endorsed such activities. The recognition that the potential for such behavior remained within vampire nature, that the same capabilities that made them effective survivors could be turned toward purposes that reduced other intelligent beings to mere resources, would serve as a constant reminder of the moral vigilance required to prevent future atrocities. The story of Regis begins not with the wise and compassionate healer that Geralt would eventually call friend, but with a creature whose appetites and impulses represented everything that mortals feared most about vampire nature. In his youth, spanning decades that would encompass entire human generations, Regis embodied the savage excess that characterized many of his kind during their early centuries of adaptation to the mortal world. He was a predator who viewed humans not as fellow intelligent beings deserving of consideration, but as sources of the intoxication that blood provided, creatures whose terror and suffering served only to enhance the pleasure of feeding. The blood-drunk years of Regis's existence were marked by a complete surrender to the addictive properties that human blood held for vampire physiology and psychology. Unlike the clinical researchers who had approached human exploitation with detached scientific methodology, Regis fed with the abandon of someone who had discovered a pleasure so intense that all other considerations became irrelevant. The sensation of consuming fresh blood was not merely nutritional sustenance, but a combination of physical euphoria and psychological revelation that transcended anything available through conventional experience. The process of feeding, for a vampire in the grip of blood addiction, involved far more than the simple consumption of a vital fluid. The act itself became a complex ritual that combined physical sensation with emotional and spiritual elements that created dependencies extending far beyond mere hunger or thirst. When Regis fed during these early years, he experienced not only the immediate pleasure of taste and the rush of energy that followed, but also glimpses into the consciousness of his victims that provided insights into human experience that no other form of interaction could offer. The psychological effects of regular blood consumption on vampire consciousness were both immediate and cumulative, creating patterns of behavior and thought that reinforced themselves through repetition until they became nearly impossible to break. Each feeding episode strengthened the neural pathways associated with hunting and predation, while weakening those connected to empathy and moral reasoning. The vampire, who began as merely hungry, gradually transformed into a creature whose entire identity revolved around the pursuit and consumption of blood, whose thoughts and dreams were dominated by anticipation of the next feeding opportunity. The escalating frequency and intensity of Regis's feeding during this period reflected the progressive nature of blood addiction, as it consumed increasing portions of his consciousness and identity. What had begun as occasional indulgence in blood's intoxicating properties gradually evolved into compulsive behavior that demanded constant satisfaction regardless of consequences or collateral damage. The intervals between feedings grew shorter, while the violence associated with each hunt increased, creating patterns of behavior that inevitably attracted attention from human communities whose members began to disappear with disturbing regularity. The territory that Regis claimed as his hunting ground during these years encompassed several small villages and farming communities whose populations provided a steady supply of victims while remaining too isolated and underpopulated to mount effective resistance against supernatural predation. The remote location of these settlements, connected to larger population centers by roads that were traveled only occasionally and often considered dangerous even under normal circumstances, offered ideal conditions for a vampire whose feeding habits had grown beyond all reasonable restraint. The methods that Regis employed during his hunting expeditions reflected both his supernatural capabilities and his complete disregard for human welfare or dignity. Rather than the quick, efficient kills that characterized more controlled vampires, his attacks were prolonged affairs that seemed designed to maximize both his victims' terror and his own pleasure in their suffering. The enhanced senses that allowed him to detect fear and pain in extraordinary detail became tools for extending and intensifying experiences that fed his addiction to emotional as well as physical consumption of his prey. The psychological state that accompanied these feeding frenzies was characterized by a loss of rational control that transformed Regis from a being capable of sophisticated thought and cultural appreciation into something closer to a force of nature driven by irresistible compulsions. In these moments, his behavior was guided not by conscious decision-making, but by instincts and drives that operated below the level of rational thought. The intellectual capabilities that normally characterized vampire consciousness became subordinated to primitive urges that treated other beings as nothing more than sources of desired sensation. The escalation of violence that marked the progression of Regis's blood addiction eventually reached levels that could no longer be concealed from or ignored by the human communities that suffered under his predation. The discovery of mutilated corpses whose condition suggested supernatural rather than merely criminal assault began to create patterns of fear and suspicion that threatened to expand beyond his immediate hunting territory. Stories of a monster stalking the night began to spread through trade networks and traveler reports, gradually building awareness that something far more dangerous than ordinary banditry was operating in the region. The investigation that eventually led to Regis's capture was initiated not by professional monster hunters or magical authorities, but by ordinary villagers whose desperation had overcome their natural fear of confronting supernatural threats. The community that had suffered most severely under his predations had gradually organized itself into hunting parties whose determination was strengthened by the recognition that their survival depended upon eliminating the creature that was systematically destroying their population. Their lack of specialized knowledge or equipment was offset by intimate familiarity with local terrain and the advantage of numbers that allowed them to mount coordinated attacks. The trap that was eventually set for Regis succeeded not through superior strategy or overwhelming force, but through the vampire's own overconfidence and the impaired judgment that resulted from his addiction-induced state of mind. The bait that drew him into the ambush was carefully selected to appeal to his preference for victims whose fear and despair would enhance the feeding experience. While the location chosen for the confrontation offered multiple escape routes that the villagers had systematically blocked using methods that took advantage of their local knowledge rather than supernatural capabilities. The battle that followed was brief but decisive, with Regis's supernatural strength and speed proving insufficient to overcome the tactical advantages that his opponents had carefully constructed. The weapons that the villagers employed were crude but effective, incorporating materials and techniques that their desperate research had suggested might prove effective against supernatural opponents. Silver implements, wooden stakes, containers of holy water, and other traditional anti-vampire defenses were used not because the villagers fully understood their theoretical effectiveness, but because they represented the only options available to mortals confronting a threat beyond their normal experience. The destruction of Regis's physical form was accomplished through methods that were both thorough and ritualistic, reflecting both practical concerns about ensuring the creature's death and psychological needs to assert control over forces that had terrorized their community for months. The decapitation that preceded other mutilations was intended to prevent any possibility of survival, while the repeated stakings that followed served to release fears and rage that had built up during long periods of helpless victimization. The holy water that was poured over the dismembered remains represented not necessarily religious faith but desperate hope that some power greater than mortal strength might ensure their tormentors' permanent destruction. The burial that concluded this grim ritual was conducted with the same thoroughness that had characterized the killing itself, with Regis's remains being interred in consecrated ground under circumstances designed to prevent any possibility of resurrection or return. The grave that was prepared for him incorporated multiple layers of protection, including blessed salt, iron implements, and wooden stakes positioned to impale any attempt at physical reconstitution. The site itself was marked with religious symbols and protective charms that reflected both Christian traditions and older folk beliefs about containing supernatural threats. The 50-year period that Regis spent regenerating beneath the earth provided him with an experience of consciousness without physical form that no mortal mind could comprehend and few vampires had ever endured. The awareness that persisted during this time was characterized by complete sensory isolation combined with perfect retention of memory and analytical capability, creating conditions of existence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and body. The psychological effects of this extended period of helpless consciousness would prove more significant than the physical trauma of his destruction. The process of regeneration itself operated according to principles that transcended normal biological understanding, with Regis's scattered remains gradually reorganizing themselves through forces that combined supernatural will with mysterious energies that seemed to operate independently of conscious control. The reconstruction of his physical form proceeded through stages that began with the smallest fragments of tissue and bone slowly drawing together, followed by the gradual restoration of organs and systems, according to some internal blueprint that preserved perfect records of his original configuration. The psychological transformation that accompanied this regeneration process was far more profound than the mere restoration of physical capabilities, representing a fundamental reassessment of values and priorities that had been made possible by the extreme circumstances of his death and resurrection. The vampire who had been consumed by blood addiction found himself confronted during his long regeneration with memories and consequences that his former state of mind had prevented him from acknowledging. The suffering he had caused, the lives he had destroyed, the communities he had terrorized, all became subjects for reflection during decades of enforced contemplation. The epiphany that marked the turning point in Regis's psychological development came not through external revelation, but through internal recognition of the futility and horror of his former existence. The pleasure that blood consumption had provided, when examined in isolation from the addictive compulsions that had driven his behavior, proved to be hollow and ultimately unsatisfying when measured against the destruction it had required. The realization that his immortal existence had been reduced to an endless cycle of temporary gratification, followed by renewed craving, marked the beginning of a commitment to fundamental change. The oath that Regis made during the final stages of his regeneration represented more than simple regret for past actions or fear of future consequences. but a genuine commitment to discovering whether vampire nature could be redirected toward purposes that served life rather than destroying it. The decision to abstain from human blood was not motivated by external pressure or magical compulsion, but by internal recognition that continued addiction would prevent any possibility of meaningful growth or development. The path he chose was one that no other vampire of his acquaintance had ever attempted, making him an experiment in the possibility of vampire redemption. The emergence from his grave after 50 years of regeneration brought Regis face to face with a world that had changed significantly during his absence, though the passage of time that seemed momentous to mortal inhabitants registered as barely noticeable to his immortal perspective. The villages that had suffered under his predation had recovered and grown, their populations showing no signs of the trauma that his presence had inflicted. The generation that had destroyed him had been replaced by children and grandchildren who knew his story only as local legend, if they knew it at all. The challenge of maintaining his oath of blood abstinence proved more difficult than Regis had anticipated during the desperate clarity of his regeneration period, requiring constant vigilance against impulses and compulsions that remained as strong as ever despite his intellectual commitment to change. The scent of human blood, encountered even incidentally through minor injuries or medical emergencies, triggered responses that were both physical and psychological in their intensity. The effort required to suppress these reactions demanded energy and attention that made every social interaction a potential test of his resolve. The development of alternative approaches to satisfying his nutritional needs led Regis to experiment with various substances and techniques that might provide adequate sustenance without requiring human blood consumption. The discovery that animal blood could meet his physical requirements, though without providing the psychological satisfaction that made human blood so addictive, represented a crucial breakthrough that made his abstinence practically sustainable. The preparation of these alternatives through careful processing and enhancement became a specialized skill that required both alchemical knowledge and ongoing experimentation. The decision to dedicate himself to healing, rather than harming, represented a conscious choice to use his supernatural capabilities in service of goals that directly contradicted his former predatory lifestyle. The medical knowledge that he acquired through study and practice allowed him to provide treatments and cures that were unavailable through conventional human medicine, while his enhanced senses made him uniquely qualified to diagnose conditions that mortal physicians might miss. The irony of a former predator becoming a protector of human life was not lost on him, but it provided a sense of purpose that blood consumption had never delivered. The years that Regis spent establishing himself as a rural healer and surgeon brought him into contact with human communities under circumstances that revealed aspects of mortality that his predatory phase had never allowed him to face. Observe. The patients who sought his help were not sources of food or objects of predation, but individuals whose courage in facing illness and injury demonstrated qualities of resilience and dignity that challenged his former assumptions about human nature. The gratitude that they expressed for his services provided satisfactions that were deeper and more lasting than any temporary pleasure that feeding had offered. The respect that Regis gradually earned within the communities he served was based not on fear of his supernatural capabilities, but on recognition of his genuine commitment to helping others, regardless of their ability to provide payment or reciprocal services. The reputation that he built through years of consistent service created relationships that approached genuine friendship despite the fundamental deception required to conceal his true nature. The experience of being valued for his contributions rather than feared for his potential for destruction provided insights into human social dynamics that transformed his understanding of what relationships between mortals and vampires might achieve. The psychological rewards of his healing work proved to be far more sustaining than the temporary satisfactions that blood addiction had provided, creating positive feedback loops that reinforced his commitment to his chosen path. rather than undermining it through constant temptation. Each successful treatment, each life saved or improved through his intervention, strengthened his sense of identity as someone who served life rather than destroying it. The meaning that he found in these activities transcended the simple pleasure-seeking that had characterized his earlier existence, providing purposes that could motivate continued effort across decades of sustained service. The friendship that eventually developed between Regis and Geralt represented the culmination of his long journey from predator to healer, demonstrating that genuine bonds could form between vampires and other intelligent beings when based on mutual respect and shared values rather than exploitation or fear. The Witcher who had dedicated his life to hunting monsters recognized in Regis someone whose commitment to protecting innocent life transcended species boundaries, while the vampire found in Geralt someone whose own struggles with his dual nature created understanding that pure mortals might never achieve. The test of Regis's transformation came during the events surrounding the Battle of Stygia Castle, when his willingness to sacrifice himself for Yennefer's protection demonstrated that his commitment to serving others had become stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. The magical assault that reduced him to molten glass represented a destruction even more complete than his first death, but it was undertaken voluntarily in service of goals that reflected his evolved moral understanding. The resurrection that followed, made possible through Detlef's assistance, proved that his redemption had been genuine rather than merely tactical, earning him aid from another of his kind who recognized the value of his transformation. The Regis who emerged from his second resurrection was someone who had been tested by the ultimate sacrifice and found worthy of continued existence, though the scars of his experiences remained visible to those who knew how to look for them. His commitment to abstinence from human blood had survived even the trauma of complete physical destruction, while his dedication to healing work continued to provide meaning and purpose that sustained him through the challenges of immortal existence. The vampire who had once embodied everything that mortals feared about his kind had become proof that even the most fundamental aspects of nature could be changed through conscious choice and sustained effort. The wisdom that Regis acquired through his journey from addiction to redemption provided insights that would prove valuable not only for his own continued development, but for other vampires who might choose to follow similar paths. His understanding of the psychological mechanisms underlying blood addiction, combined with his practical experience in developing alternative approaches to vampire nutrition and social interaction, created knowledge that could potentially transform how his entire species related to the mortal world. The living example that he represented suggested possibilities for vampire-human coexistence that went far beyond mere tolerance to encompass genuine cooperation and mutual benefit. Yet even as Regis celebrated his successful transformation from monster to healer, he remained aware that the potential for regression continued to exist within his nature, requiring constant vigilance and conscious choice to maintain the progress he had achieved. The vampire who had learned to choose healing over harming understood better than most that redemption was not a permanent state but an ongoing process that required daily commitment to values and behaviors that served life rather than destroying it. His story provided hope for the possibility of change while acknowledging the challenges that such change required, offering a vision of what vampire nature might become when guided by wisdom and compassion rather than appetite and impulse. The tale of Detlef van der Eretine begins not with the tragic events that would make him infamous throughout the Duchy of Toussaint, but with centuries of solitude that had shaped him into something far more complex than the simple monster that his eventual actions might suggest. Unlike vampires such as Regis, who had found ways to integrate themselves into mortal society, or those who had embraced predatory lifestyles that brought them into regular contact with human communities, Detlef had chosen a path of almost complete isolation that reflected both his philosophical approach to vampire existence and his deep ambivalence about his own nature. The centuries of self-imposed exile that preceded Detlef's involvement in the events surrounding the Beast of Beauclair had been spent in remote wilderness areas where human presence was minimal and the risk of discovery or conflict remained virtually non-existent. The caves and mountain strongholds that he claimed as temporary residences were chosen not for comfort or convenience, but for their complete separation from the mortal world. Places where he could exist for decades without encountering another intelligent being or facing the moral complexities that such encounters inevitably created for someone of his philosophical disposition. The solitude that Detlef embraced during these long years was not born from misanthropy or contempt for other forms of life, but from a profound uncertainty about his own capacity for moral behavior that made isolation seem like the most responsible choice available to him. Unlike vampires who had tested themselves against the temptations of human interaction and either succeeded or failed in maintaining ethical standards, Detlef had chosen to avoid such tests entirely, recognizing that his own nature remained sufficiently alien and potentially dangerous that exposure to sustained temptation might produce results that would violate his personal moral standards. The philosophical framework that guided Detlef's approach to existence was built upon recognition of the fundamental incompatibility between vampire nature and the moral principles that governed civilized behavior among intelligent beings. His understanding of his own psychology led him to conclude that the safest course for everyone involved was complete separation, removing himself from situations where his predatory instincts might overcome his intellectual commitment to ethical behavior. This approach represented not cowardice but a form of moral courage that required accepting perpetual loneliness as the price of avoiding potential harm to others. The few interactions that Detlef had maintained with other vampires during his centuries of isolation provided the only relief from his self-imposed exile, while reinforcing his conviction that his chosen path was both necessary and sustainable. The occasional meetings with creatures like Regis offered opportunities for conversation and companionship that reminded him of what he had sacrificed in choosing solitude, but they also confirmed his belief that integration into mortal society required capabilities and compromises that he was unwilling or unable to make. The respect that other vampires showed for his choice validated his decision, while highlighting the loneliness that was its inevitable consequence. The heroic acts that had occasionally drawn Detlef from his isolation were performed not in pursuit of recognition or reward, but from a sense of moral obligation that compelled him to act when his unique capabilities could prevent large-scale suffering or injustice. The defeat of the Brute of Illyria 3 centuries earlier had represented exactly this kind of intervention, undertaken because the creature's rampage threatened innocent lives, and no other force appeared capable of stopping its destructive progress. The decision to emerge from hiding and confront such a powerful opponent required courage that went far beyond simple physical bravery, to encompass willingness to risk exposure and potential persecution for the sake of strangers who would never know his identity. The aftermath of such heroic interventions typically involved Detlef's immediate withdrawal back into isolation, as if the brief contact with the external world had reminded him of both his capacity for positive action and the dangers that such action entailed. The gratitude and recognition that might have followed his defeat of the Brute never reached him because he had vanished back into the wilderness before anyone could identify him or offer thanks for his intervention. This pattern of anonymous heroism followed by renewed isolation became characteristic of his approach to moral responsibility, allowing him to serve the greater good while avoiding the complications that sustained interaction with other intelligent beings would have created. The psychological toll of such extended isolation was something that Detlef bore with the stoic endurance that characterized much of vampire culture, though the effects inevitably accumulated over time in ways that shaped his personality and worldview. The absence of regular social interaction left him with communication skills that were technically adequate but lacking in the subtle nuances that made normal conversation comfortable and natural. His understanding of mortal concerns and motivations, while intellectually sophisticated, was based more on observation and analysis than on genuine empathy developed through shared experience. The decision to emerge from isolation and involve himself in the social and political complexities of Toussaint represented a fundamental departure from the principles that had guided Detlef's existence for centuries. Motivated not by changing philosophical convictions, but by emotions and attachments that had developed despite his best efforts to avoid such complications. The relationship that drew him from his self-imposed exile was not the product of careful consideration or rational decision-making, but of feelings that had overwhelmed the intellectual frameworks he had constructed to manage his existence as an immortal being in a mortal world. The woman who would become the center of Detlef's emotional universe was Siana. Though the name by which he knew her, and the identity she presented to him, bore little resemblance to the complex and damaged individual whose past had shaped her into someone capable of the manipulations that would ultimately destroy them both. The Sylvia Anna who approached him in the forest was presented as someone seeking help rather than offering it. A mortal in distress, whose vulnerability appealed to protective instincts that Detlef had not realized he possessed until they were awakened by her apparent need for assistance and companionship. The relationship that developed between them violated every principle of caution and self-preservation that had guided Detlef through centuries of successful isolation. Yet it provided experiences of connection and meaning that his solitary existence had never offered. The conversations they shared revealed aspects of mortal experience that his observations had never penetrated, while the emotional intimacy that grew between them created bonds that transcended the merely physical to touch deeper needs that he had not acknowledged even to himself. For the first time in his long existence, Detlef discovered what it might mean to care about another being more than he cared about his own safety or principles. The gradual revelation of Siana's true identity and the complex web of deceptions that surrounded her relationship with the ducal court of Toussaint created moral dilemmas that Detlef's centuries of isolation had not prepared him to navigate. The woman he had come to love was not the simple victim of circumstances that she had originally appeared to be, but someone whose past was marked by genuine grievances against those who had wronged her, and whose present actions were motivated by desires for revenge that she had concealed beneath facades of vulnerability and need. The discovery that he had been drawn into a conspiracy whose goals he did not fully understand challenged his assumptions about both his judgment and his capacity for meaningful relationships. The manipulation that had brought them together was revealed to be far more sophisticated than simple romantic deception, involving psychological techniques that had been carefully designed to appeal to specific aspects of vampire psychology and moral philosophy. Siana's apparent helplessness had been calculated to trigger protective responses that would override Detlef's normal caution, while her expressions of understanding and acceptance had been crafted to address the isolation and loneliness that were inevitable consequences of his chosen lifestyle. The realization that emotions he had believed to be genuine and spontaneous had been deliberately induced created a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than mere romantic disappointment. The political complications that surrounded the Beast of Beauclair investigation forced Detlef to navigate social and institutional structures that his centuries of isolation had left him completely unprepared to understand or manage effectively. The court intrigues and aristocratic maneuvering that characterized life in Toussaint's capital operated according to rules and assumptions that were foreign to his direct and uncomplicated approach to moral questions. The discovery that he had become a pawn in conflicts between the Duchess and her sister revealed layers of deception and manipulation that extended far beyond his personal relationship with Siana. The greenhouse confrontation that revealed his true nature to Geralt and the other investigators marked the end of Detlef's attempt to maintain any pretense of normal involvement in mortal affairs, forcing him to acknowledge that his vampire identity could not be concealed indefinitely from those who possessed the knowledge and experience necessary to recognize supernatural involvement. The transformation that followed was not merely a defensive response to immediate danger, but an expression of frustration and rage that had been building throughout his exposure to the complexities and deceptions that characterized human civilization at its most sophisticated levels. The chase that followed through the streets and rooftops of Beauclair provided Detlef with his first opportunity to exercise his supernatural capabilities without restraint since his emergence from isolation. Yet the experience brought no satisfaction or relief from the emotional turmoil that had been created by the revelation of Sienna's betrayal. The physical expression of his vampire nature felt more like a burden than a release, a reminder of the alien qualities that set him apart from other intelligent beings and made genuine relationships with mortals inherently problematic, if not impossible. The psychological deterioration that followed Detlef's discovery of the full extent of Sienna's manipulations was exacerbated by his lack of experience in managing complex emotional responses and his absence of social support. Networks that might have provided perspective and assistance in processing such devastating revelations. The centuries of isolation that had protected him from most forms of interpersonal conflict had left him without the psychological tools necessary for dealing with betrayal and loss, creating vulnerabilities that his immortal nature and supernatural capabilities could not address or compensate for. The growing obsession with revenge that began to consume Detlef's thoughts and motivations represented not merely anger at personal betrayal, but a fundamental challenge to the worldview that had sustained him through centuries of bossided, solitary existence. The discovery that his attempts to engage with mortal civilization had resulted in manipulation and exploitation rather than genuine connection forced him to confront questions about whether peaceful coexistence between vampires and humans was possible under any circumstances, or whether his original instincts toward isolation had been not just prudent but necessary for moral as well as practical reasons. The systematic campaign of murders that followed was conceived not as random violence, but as a carefully planned demonstration of vampire capabilities and mortal vulnerability designed to illustrate the futility of attempts to manipulate or control beings whose power exceeded anything that human civilization could effectively oppose. Each killing was selected to send specific messages about the consequences of deception and betrayal, while the methods employed were chosen to demonstrate supernatural abilities that would make clear the true nature of the threat that had been awakened by Sienna's machinations. The decision to unleash lesser vampires upon Beauclair during the Night of Long Fangs represented Detlef's final abandonment of any pretense of maintaining peaceful relations with mortal civilization, marking his transition from reluctant participant in human affairs to active enemy of everything that mortal society represented. The creatures that answered his call were not merely weapons in a personal vendetta, but symbols of the chaos and destruction that vampires could visit upon human communities when the restraints of civilized behavior were abandoned in favor of direct action based on superior force. The coordination required to organize and direct such a diverse array of supernatural creatures demonstrated capabilities that Detlef had never revealed during his centuries of isolation, suggesting that his apparent withdrawal from vampire society had not prevented him from maintaining awareness of and influence over the lesser members of his species. The efficiency with which the attack was conducted, the precision with which specific targets were selected, and the control that was maintained over creatures whose natural inclinations ran toward chaotic violence, all testified to powers of command and organization that had remained hidden beneath his facade of simple solitude. The terror that swept through Beauclair during this supernatural assault served multiple purposes within Detlef's campaign of revenge, demonstrating both his capacity for large-scale destruction and his willingness to accept civilian casualties as acceptable costs of his war against those who had wronged him. The indiscriminate nature of the violence that was unleashed made clear that his moral framework no longer recognized distinctions between guilty and innocent among the human population, treating all mortals as complicit in the deceptions and manipulations that had destroyed his relationship with Cyanna. The psychological transformation that had converted Detlef from protector of innocent life to architect of mass destruction represented not merely personal breakdown but a fundamental shift in his understanding of the relationship between vampire and human nature. The betrayal he had experienced had convinced him that attempts at peaceful coexistence were doomed to failure because mortal psychology was inherently duplicitous and manipulative, making genuine trust or partnership impossible between species whose capabilities and lifespans were so radically different. The ultimatum that Detlef delivered through his campaign of violence was designed not to achieve specific political goals, but to force recognition of vampire power and the consequences of treating immortal beings as pawns in mortal schemes. His demand for Cyanna's surrender was less about personal revenge than about establishing principles that would govern future interactions between vampires and human authorities, making clear that deception and manipulation of his kind would be met with overwhelming retaliation regardless of the costs to innocent populations. The moral complexity of Detlef's position was evident in the genuine grief and regret he expressed for the necessity of violence while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge alternatives that might have avoided or minimized civilian casualties. His conviction that he had been forced into his course of action by the betrayals he had suffered created a psychological framework that absolved him of responsibility for the consequences, while placing all blame upon those whose deceptions had precipitated the crisis. The final confrontation between Detlef and the forces arrayed against him would test not only his supernatural capabilities, but also the philosophical foundations upon which he had built his justifications for the campaign of terror he had unleashed upon Beauclair. The vampire who had emerged from centuries of isolation seeking connection and meaning would face the ultimate challenge of reconciling his actions with the moral principles that had originally motivated his withdrawal from mortal society. The resolution of this conflict would determine not only his personal fate, but the future of vampire-human relations in a region where the careful balance of secrecy and tolerance had been shattered by the revelation of what happened when immortal patience finally reached its limits. In the deepest reaches of Toussaint's ancient landscape, where the rolling vineyards and fairy tale castles gave way to primordial wilderness that predated human settlement by countless millennia, there existed a place that challenged every assumption about the relationship between physical reality and supernatural power. The unseen Elder's domain was not merely a hidden cave or forgotten ruin, but a nexus where the fundamental laws that governed ordinary existence bent and twisted according to forces that transcended mortal understanding, creating an environment that served as both sanctuary and prison for the most ancient and powerful vampire in the known world. The approach to this legendary lair required more than simple courage or determination, demanding instead a form of magical navigation that few beings possessed the knowledge or capability to attempt. The passages that led toward the Elder's domain were concealed not just by physical barriers or illusion, but by distortions in the fabric of reality itself that made conventional exploration impossible. Those who sought to reach the ancient vampire without proper preparation and authorization would find themselves walking in circles through tunnels that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, their progress constantly diverted by spatial anomalies that protected the Elder's privacy more effectively than any army or fortress wall. The key that granted access to this impossible realm was itself an artifact that spoke to the sophisticated magical technologies that vampires had developed during their millennia of existence in the mortal world. The device that Oriana provided to those seeking the Elder's audience was not merely a physical object but a focus for supernatural energies that could temporarily override the protective enchantments surrounding the domain. The blood that was required to activate the key served not just as identification but as a form of mystical password that confirmed the bearer's right to approach one whose power exceeded that of ordinary vampires by orders of magnitude that defied easy comprehension. The cavern system that housed the Elder's lair was a geological formation that appeared to have been shaped by forces far more ancient and powerful than the natural processes that had carved the surrounding landscape. The walls bore traces of minerals and crystalline structures that existed nowhere else in the known world, their composition suggesting influences from dimensions or realities that operated according to different physical laws. The very air within these passages carried properties that affected both magical and mundane senses in ways that marked the transition from ordinary reality to something far more alien and dangerous. The paintings that adorned the cave walls in the outer chambers provided the first clear indication that this place had been occupied by intelligent beings for periods that stretched back far beyond recorded history. The artwork depicted scenes and figures that were recognizably vampiric in nature, but rendered in styles and techniques that suggested cultural traditions extending across millennia of continuous occupation. The pigments used in these ancient murals possessed luminescent qualities that provided illumination without any apparent source of energy, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling for visitors accustomed to more conventional environments. The progression deeper into the cave system revealed increasingly dramatic violations of normal physical principles that demonstrated the Elder's influence over the fundamental forces that governed material existence. Passages that should have led downward began to curve upward without any apparent change in direction, while corridors that appeared to be level suddenly revealed themselves to be climbing steep inclines that defied gravitational logic. The waterfall that flowed upward in direct contradiction to natural law served as perhaps the most striking example of how completely ordinary reality had been subordinated to supernatural will within the Elder's domain. The discovery of human remains and equipment within the deeper chambers provided sobering evidence of previous attempts to reach the Elder by individuals whose preparation or authorization had proved inadequate for the challenge they had undertaken. The mage whose expedition had ended in failure represented not just personal tragedy, but a warning about the dangers faced by even highly skilled magical practitioners who underestimated the forces they sought to confront. The careful preservation of his remains and possessions suggested that the Elder was not entirely without respect for those who had died attempting to reach him, though such consideration clearly had not extended to preventing their deaths. The magical equipment that had been abandoned by the failed expedition revealed the sophisticated techniques that had been employed in the attempt to penetrate the Elder's defenses and establish communication with the ancient vampire. The megascope that lay damaged among the scattered books and research materials represented technology that combined the highest achievements of human magical science with desperate innovation born of necessity. The failure of such advanced equipment to achieve its intended purpose illustrated the vast gulf that separated even accomplished mortal magic users from beings whose power operated on scales that transcended conventional understanding. The gravitational anomalies that became increasingly pronounced as one approached the Elder's personal chambers created environmental conditions that challenged both physical coordination and psychological equilibrium for visitors, whose biology had evolved to function within normal physical parameters. The sensation of walking on walls and ceilings while water flowed in impossible directions produced a form of spatial disorientation that went beyond mere confusion to approach genuine vertigo and nausea. These effects appeared to be not accidental byproducts of the Elder's presence, but deliberate features designed to test the resolve and capabilities of those who sought audience with him. The crystalline formations that lined the innermost chambers possessed properties that suggested they served functions far more complex than simple decoration or natural geological processes. The structures pulsed with energies that resonated with magical forces in ways that indicated their role as components in supernatural systems whose purposes remained mysterious to outside observation. The patterns of their growth and arrangement seemed to follow mathematical principles that incorporated elements of sacred geometry and magical theory, creating frameworks that might serve as focuses for powers that operated according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. The transition from the outer chambers to the Elder's personal domain marked a qualitative shift in the nature of the supernatural forces at work within the cave system, moving from mere violations of physical law to something approaching the complete reconstruction of reality according to alien principles. The air itself became thick with energies that affected consciousness as well as physical sensation, creating states of awareness that combined hyperacute perception with profound psychological unease. Visitors to this inner sanctum found themselves experiencing reality through senses that had been temporarily enhanced or altered by their proximity to power that transcended normal categories of existence. The ancient armor that could be discovered within the Elder's domain represented craftsmanship that combined vampire metallurgical techniques with materials and design principles that suggested origins predating their arrival in the mortal world. The Hen Guide armor, whose name carried meanings that were lost to all but the most ancient vampire scholars, incorporated protective and enhancement properties that far exceeded anything achieved by mortal armorers. The fact that such artifacts had been preserved within the Elder's lair suggested their significance to vampire culture and history, though their specific purposes and the circumstances of their creation remained mysteries that the Elder showed no inclination to explain. The protocols that governed interaction with the unseen Elder reflected both the practical necessities of approaching such a powerful being and the cultural traditions that had developed around vampire hierarchy and respect during their millennia of existence. The requirement for genuflection was not mere ceremony, but recognition of power relationships that were both absolute and potentially lethal for those who failed to observe proper forms. The words of greeting that had to be spoken in the ancient vampire language served not just as politeness, but as demonstrations of cultural knowledge and respect for traditions that connected all vampires to their origins. The gifts that were expected as part of the audience ritual represented more than simple tribute or bribery, functioning instead as symbols of the supplicant's understanding of their position relative to the Elder's power and authority. The nature of appropriate offerings reflected vampire values and aesthetics in ways that demonstrated genuine comprehension of their culture rather than mere compliance with external requirements. The failure to present suitable gifts or to observe proper protocols could result not just in dismissal but in violent termination of the audience, as the Elder's patience with ignorance or disrespect was limited by standards that allowed no margin for error. The Elder's physical form, when he chose to reveal himself to visitors, challenged every expectation about vampire appearance and behavior that had been developed through contact with lesser members of their species. Unlike vampires such as Regis or Detlef, who maintained human-like appearances that allowed them to function within mortal society, the Elder had long since abandoned any pretense of resembling other intelligent species. His form was purely functional, adapted for existence within his domain and for the exercise of powers that required no accommodation to the expectations or comfort of other beings. The communication methods that the Elder employed during audiences reflected both his ancient age and his complete separation from the concerns that motivated younger vampires in their interactions with the external world. His speech, when he chose to use language at all, was sparse and precise, conveying information and commands with economy that wasted no words on courtesy or explanation. The telepathic abilities that he possessed allowed him to extract information directly from visitors' minds, making elaborate verbal exchanges unnecessary and potentially redundant given his capacity to access thoughts and memories without cooperation from their owners. The Elder's relationship with time and causality operated according to principles that reflected his immense age and the accumulation of experiences that spanned geological epochs rather than mere centuries. His perspective on current events was shaped by memories that extended back to the conjunction of the spheres and beyond, creating frameworks for understanding that incorporated patterns and cycles invisible to beings whose existence measured decades or centuries rather than millennia. This temporal perspective made him simultaneously wise beyond measure and alien beyond comprehension, capable of insights that transcended mortal understanding while remaining fundamentally disconnected from the immediate concerns that motivated other intelligent beings. The gateway that the Elder guarded represented not merely a passage between different locations, but a connection to the vampire homeworld that had been lost during the cosmic catastrophe of the conjunction. The interdimensional portal that lay concealed within his domain served as both a link to their origins and a potential route for return, though the conditions required for its activation remained beyond the capabilities of any beings save the Elder himself. The protection of this gateway was not just a responsibility, but an obsession that had shaped his existence for millennia, making him simultaneously guardian and prisoner of forces that connected his adopted world to realms beyond mortal imagination. The Elder's authority over all other vampires was not based on political appointment or social agreement, but represented recognition of power, relationships that were both absolute and inescapable for beings whose existence depended upon his tolerance and protection. His commands were not suggestions or requests, but statements of reality that would be implemented regardless of the preferences or objections of those affected. The obedience that he commanded from even ancient and powerful vampires like Detlef was not voluntary submission, but acknowledgement of hierarchy that reflected fundamental facts about vampire society and individual capabilities. The isolation that characterized the Elder's existence was not merely physical separation from other beings, but represented a form of psychological and spiritual solitude that transcended ordinary concepts of loneliness or social withdrawal. His consciousness operated on scales and according to principles that made meaningful communication with lesser beings difficult, if not impossible, creating barriers that went beyond simple preference or personality to encompass fundamental differences in the nature of awareness itself. The visitors who sought his aid or knowledge represented temporary interruptions in an existence that was defined primarily by contemplation and guardianship of forces that required eternal vigilance. The wisdom that the Elder possessed regarding vampire nature and the broader patterns of existence was balanced by a form of detachment that made him largely indifferent to the individual concerns and struggles that motivated other members of his species. His understanding of destiny and causality was comprehensive but cold, recognizing patterns and probabilities without the emotional investment that might make such knowledge personally meaningful. The advice or assistance that he might provide to supplicants was given not from compassion or concern, but from recognition that certain interventions served purposes that aligned with his own long-term objectives and responsibilities. The power that the Elder wielded within his domain extended far beyond simple physical capabilities to encompass control over fundamental forces that governed reality itself within the boundaries of his influence. His ability to manipulate gravity, space, and time reflected not just personal abilities, but connection to sources of energy and authority that transcended individual consciousness to tap into cosmic forces that had shaped the universe since its beginning. The demonstration of such power served both practical purposes in maintaining his security and psychological functions in establishing his position within vampire hierarchy. The mystery that surrounded the Elder's origins and the true extent of his capabilities remained impenetrable even to vampires who had known him for centuries. creating an aura of legend and speculation that enhanced his authority while maintaining the distance necessary for effective rule over beings whose own power might otherwise challenge his supremacy. The questions about whether he was simply an ancient member of the vampire species or something qualitatively different, whether his power was inherent or acquired, whether his isolation was chosen or imposed, all remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable given his reluctance to provide explanations or justifications for his existence or behavior. The Elder's role as ultimate arbiter of vampire law and custom was exercised not through active intervention in the affairs of his subjects, but through the knowledge that his power was available when needed and that his judgment, when rendered, would be final and absolute. The fear and respect that he inspired in other vampires served to maintain order and discipline within their communities without requiring his direct involvement in most situations, creating a system of governance that operated efficiently despite the absence of visible authority structures or enforcement mechanisms. The future that awaited both the Elder and the vampire species as a whole remained as mysterious and unknowable as his past, dependent upon forces and decisions that transcended the immediate concerns of individuals or communities to encompass the broader patterns of cosmic development and change. The guardian who protected the gateway between worlds might someday choose to open that passage and lead his people home, or he might continue his eternal vigil until the end of time itself, protecting secrets and powers that the universe was not yet ready to comprehend or safely contain. The final confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Beauclair, but the future of vampire-human relations throughout the Northern Kingdoms began not with the clash of supernatural powers, but with a moment of recognition between two ancient beings whose friendship had survived centuries of separation and profound philosophical differences. When Regis materialized from crimson mist in the shadow of Teshem Mutna's ancient walls, when his form solidified between Geralt and the enraged Detlef whose fury had already claimed so many innocent lives, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of obligations and loyalties that transcended simple concepts of right and wrong. The reunion between the two higher vampires carried undertones of tragedy that were immediately apparent to anyone who understood the significance of what was about to unfold. These were not merely old friends meeting under difficult circumstances, but beings whose immortal existence had been shaped by shared experiences that stretched back across centuries of adaptation to a world that had never fully accepted their presence. The bond that connected them had been forged through mutual understanding of burdens that no other beings could comprehend, strengthened by respect for each other's choices in navigating the impossible complexities of vampire existence in a mortal world. Regis's attempt to mediate between Detlef's rage and the necessity of protecting innocent human lives reflected both his evolved moral philosophy and his deep understanding of the psychology that had driven his friend to such peace. Extremes of violence. The words that passed between them carried the weight of centuries of shared history, references to experiences and conversations that had shaped both their understanding of what it meant to be vampire in a world that feared and misunderstood their true nature. The sadness in Regis's voice as he tried to reason with Detlef revealed his recognition that the friend he remembered might already be lost to the fury that had consumed his capacity for rational thought. The philosophical debate that emerged from their confrontation touched upon fundamental questions about vampire nature and moral responsibility that had no easy answers and would likely continue to divide their species for millennia to come. Detlef's conviction that his actions were justified by the betrayals he had suffered reflected a worldview that placed personal honor above the welfare of innocent bystanders, while Regis's attempts to argue for restraint and proportionality demonstrated his commitment to principles that transcended species loyalty. The conflict between these positions was not merely academic, but represented competing visions of what vampire existence in the mortal world could or should become. The transformation that began to overtake both vampires as their debate intensified marked the transition from intellectual disagreement to something far more primal and dangerous. The emergence of aspects of their nature that civilization had taught them to suppress but could never entirely eliminate. The changes that rippled through their bodies as emotion overwhelmed rational control were not mere shape-shifting, but fundamental alterations in their relationship to physical reality itself. Their human facades dissolved to reveal forms that were more truthful expressions of their alien nature, creatures whose biology operated according to principles that had evolved in realms where different natural laws prevailed. The speed and grace with which they moved as their conflict escalated transcended anything that mortal eyes could easily follow, creating a display of supernatural combat that resembled a deadly dance more than conventional warfare. Their attacks and counterattacks flowed with fluid precision that reflected centuries of experience in wielding abilities that far exceeded normal physical limitations. The sound of their claws meeting in mid-air rang like metal, striking metal, producing sparks and resonances that spoke to the incredible forces being unleashed with each exchange. The mist forms that both vampires could assume allowed them to avoid attacks that would have been impossible to dodge through conventional movement, their bodies dispersing into crimson clouds that could reform in new positions faster than human perception could track. The ability to become incorporeal will transformed their battle into something that operated partially outside normal spatial constraints, with combatants who could strike from impossible angles and disappear before retaliation could be mounted. The visual effect of vampires fading in and out of material existence created an otherworldly spectacle that challenged observers' understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical form. The psychological aspects of their combat were as significant as the physical exchanges, with each vampire drawing upon intimate knowledge of the other's personality and capabilities to anticipate attacks and exploit weaknesses that only centuries of friendship could have revealed. Regis's understanding of Detlef's tendency toward explosive fury allowed him to defend against assaults that might have overwhelmed opponents who lacked such insight, while Detlef's knowledge of his friend's philosophical constraints created opportunities to press advantages that a less familiar adversary might not have recognized. The emotional weight of their conflict was evident in every movement and gesture, transforming what might have been a simple contest of strength and skill into something approaching tragedy in its classical sense. These were not enemies driven by hatred or strangers fighting over territory, but friends whose fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility had made violence inevitable despite their mutual respect and shared history. The sorrow that was visible in their attacks, the reluctance that tempered their most devastating techniques, spoke to the cost that such conflicts extracted from beings whose immortal existence made every relationship precious beyond measure. Geralt's intervention in their supernatural duel represented not just courage but recognition that the outcome of their private conflict would have consequences extending far beyond their personal relationship. The Witcher, who had dedicated his life to hunting monsters, found himself in the unprecedented position of fighting alongside one supernatural creature to subdue another, forced to choose sides in a dispute between beings whose power far exceeded his own. The oils and potions that he employed to enhance his capabilities provided only marginal advantages against opponents who could ignore most of the physical laws that constrained ordinary combat. The tactical challenge that Geralt faced in engaging Detlef while avoiding interference with Regis's efforts required split-second decisions about positioning and timing that pushed his enhanced reflexes to their absolute limits. The vampire whose rage had been unleashed upon Beauclair fought with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose, his attacks carrying not just physical force but emotional weight that made every exchange potentially lethal. The coordination required to fight effectively alongside Regis, while both struggled against an opponent who knew their capabilities intimately demanded trust and communication that transcended normal combat partnerships. The progression of Detlef's transformations as the battle intensified revealed the full extent of his supernatural capabilities while demonstrating the depths of his psychological deterioration. Each new form that he assumed was more monstrous and destructive than the last, reflecting both his increasing desperation and his abandonment of any pretense of restraint or mercy. The vampire who had once sought isolation to avoid harming others now embraced abilities that were designed specifically to inflict maximum damage and terror upon anyone who opposed his will. The winged form that Detlef eventually assumed represented perhaps the most alien aspect of his true nature, a configuration that allowed him to move through three-dimensional space with complete freedom while raining down attacks from angles that ground-based opponents could not effectively counter. The vast wingspan that supported his aerial assaults created wind currents that disrupted the footing and balance of those fighting below, while his ability to swoop and climb with impossible speed made him a virtually untouchable adversary for anyone lacking similar capabilities. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who could strike from any direction while remaining beyond reach added layers of difficulty to an already impossible combat situation. The colony of bats that Detlef could summon and control represented not just additional combatants but extensions of his own consciousness and will. Creatures whose collective intelligence allowed for coordinated attacks that overwhelmed individual defensive capabilities. The swarm that engulfed his opponents created not only physical barriers to movement and vision, but psychological pressure that exploited primal fears of being consumed by forces too numerous and mobile to fight effectively. The ability to disperse his consciousness across multiple forms while maintaining central control demonstrated mastery of vampire abilities that few of his kind had ever achieved. The illusions that accompanied Detlef's final transformations challenged the fundamental distinction between reality and hallucination, creating experiences that were simultaneously supernatural manifestation and psychological assault. The recreation of internal body spaces that surrounded Geralt during the climactic phases of their battle was not merely visual deception, but a form of existential attack that challenged his sense of identity and location within physical space. The heartbeats that echoed through these impossible environments served as both soundtrack and countdown to destruction, marking time according to rhythms that operated outside normal temporal constraints. The vulnerability that Detlef revealed during these ultimate transformations was paradoxically both his greatest strength and his most exploitable weakness, creating opportunities for his opponents to inflict damage while simultaneously exposing them to his most devastating attacks. The moments when his various forms were transitioning between configurations provided brief windows during which conventional weapons could penetrate defenses that were otherwise impregnable, but exploiting these opportunities required timing and precision that left no margin for error. The risk-reward calculations involved in attempting to damage him during these vulnerable periods demanded decisions that could prove instantly fatal if executed incorrectly. The gradual wearing down of Detlef's seemingly inexhaustible energy reserves reflected not just the cumulative effects of sustained combat, but the psychological toll of fighting against opponents whose resistance forced him to confront the futility of his campaign of revenge. Each failed attack, each defensive success by his adversaries, chipped away at the certainty that had sustained his fury while creating doubt about whether violence could truly provide the satisfaction and resolution he sought. The vampire whose rage had seemed unlimited began to show signs of exhaustion that went beyond mere physical depletion to encompass spiritual and emotional fatigue. The moment when Detlef finally faltered, when his transformations began to lose their coherence and his attacks became desperate rather than calculated, marked the beginning of the end for a being whose power had seemed virtually unlimited. The wounds that began to accumulate on his various forms were not merely physical injuries, but symbols of his diminishing will to continue a battle whose purpose had become unclear even to himself. The realization that his opponent's determination to stop him exceeded his own commitment to destroying them created a psychological shift that undermined his ability to maintain the fury that had sustained his supernatural abilities. The final collapse of Detlef's resistance came not through overwhelming force, but through the gradual recognition that continued fighting would achieve nothing beyond the extension of suffering for everyone involved. The vampire who had unleashed such destruction upon Beauclair found himself facing the prospect of eternal combat with no possibility of victory or meaningful resolution, a future that offered only endless repetition of violence without purpose or satisfaction. The choice to surrender was not defeat, but recognition that some battles could not be won and some forms of justice could not be achieved through force alone. The sacred law that had governed vampire society for millennia now demanded its ultimate price, requiring Regis to violate the most fundamental prohibition of his species in order to end the threat that his friend had become. The necessity of killing another higher vampire represented not just personal tragedy, but a form of spiritual catastrophe that challenged the basic principles upon which vampire civilization had been built. The code that had prevented vampire-on-vampire violence for centuries was about to be broken by someone whose commitment to protecting mortal life had overcome even the deepest bonds of species loyalty. The final exchange between Regis and Detlef before the killing blow was delivered carried the weight of centuries of friendship and understanding, words that served as both farewell and forgiveness between beings who had chosen different paths through the moral complexities of vampire existence. The recognition that their conflict had been inevitable, given their fundamental disagreements about responsibility and justice, provided some measure of peace to both participants, though it could not eliminate the tragedy of what was about to unfold. The tears that flowed as Regis prepared to end his friend's life spoke to the cost of choices that honored principle above personal loyalty. The death of Detlef van der Eretine marked not just the end of an individual existence, but the conclusion of an era in vampire-human relations that had been characterized by cautious coexistence and mutual avoidance of direct confrontation. The permanent nature of his destruction, so different from the temporary deaths that other vampires had experienced, served as a reminder that some actions carried consequences that could not be undone through time or supernatural intervention. The violence that had consumed Beauclair was finally ended, but the questions it had raised about the possibility of true peace between immortal and mortal beings remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The aftermath of the battle left Regis in a position that no vampire had occupied for centuries, branded as both hero and betrayer by different segments of his species, depending upon their perspective on the events that had transpired. The vampire who had chosen mortal welfare over species loyalty would face exile from the community that had been his only source of understanding and acceptance throughout his long existence. The price of doing what he believed to be right was isolation even more complete than what Detlef had chosen voluntarily, separation that could only be survived through the strength of conviction that had motivated his ultimate choice. The implications of what had occurred extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass questions about vampire nature, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption that would influence how both species viewed each other for generations to come. The battle that had ended with the death of one ancient vampire had revealed truths about the potential for both destruction and sacrifice that challenged comfortable assumptions about the relationship between power and morality. The lesson that even immortal beings must face consequences for their choices would resonate through vampire society long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The profound encounter between mortal and immortal consciousness that characterized the relationship between higher vampires and the human populations among whom they lived revealed fundamental truths about the nature of intelligence, emotion, and moral responsibility that transcended the boundaries of species and challenged every assumption that either group had developed about the other. The lessons learned through centuries of coexistence, conflict, and gradual understanding provided insights into the deepest questions of existence while simultaneously highlighting the vast gulfs that separated beings whose evolutionary paths had diverged so dramatically that mutual comprehension remained perpetually incomplete. The psychological differences between vampire and human consciousness operated at levels so fundamental that even the most sophisticated attempts at understanding often failed to bridge the conceptual gaps that separated immortal from mortal perspectives on existence. Where human psychology was shaped by the constant awareness of limited time and the inevitability of death, vampire consciousness developed within frameworks that assumed infinite duration and the possibility of surviving any conceivable catastrophe. These contrasting relationships with time and mortality created worldviews that were not merely different but often mutually incomprehensible, leading to misunderstandings that could escalate into conflicts despite the best intentions of all parties involved. The emotional responses that characterized vampire psychology reflected not the absence of feeling that human folklore often attributed to them, but rather the presence of emotions so alien to mortal experience that they were frequently mistaken for coldness or cruelty. The grief that an immortal being experienced when losing someone they cared about was not the acute but ultimately healing sorrow that humans knew, but a form of endless mourning that could persist for centuries without resolution. The love that vampires felt for mortal companions was complicated by the knowledge that such relationships were fundamentally temporary, creating attachments that were simultaneously deeper and more painful than anything possible between beings of similar lifespans. The traditional defenses that human communities had developed against vampire predation were revealed through direct experience to be largely ineffective against higher vampires, whose capabilities transcended the limitations that such measures might impose upon lesser supernatural threats. The garlic that was supposed to repel them had no effect whatsoever, while wooden stakes and silver weapons could cause damage but could never achieve the permanent destruction that folklore promised. Holy water and religious symbols held no power over beings whose existence predated and operated independently of human spiritual traditions. And crosses or prayer could not protect against creatures whose alien nature placed them beyond the reach of mortal theological frameworks. The sunlight that was supposed to be fatal to vampires proved to be merely another environmental condition that higher vampires could tolerate without difficulty, their enhanced physiology adapting to daylight exposure with no more discomfort than humans experienced from minor changes in temperature. The mirrors that were supposed to reveal their nature by showing no reflection actually reflected their images normally, while their shadows fell across the ground exactly as those of any other physical beings. The invisibility to detection that they achieved came not from supernatural concealment, but from careful attention to blending into human society through behavior and appearance, rather than relying on magical camouflage. The most reliable methods for identifying higher vampires among human populations required close observation of subtle behavioral patterns and physical characteristics that were difficult to detect without specific knowledge and extended from Bake's 4-2-do. Contact. The enhanced reflexes that allowed them to respond to threats faster than human perception could track might occasionally manifest in moments of unguarded reaction, while their supernatural strength could be revealed through casual actions that produced results far exceeding normal human capabilities. The absence of natural breathing patterns, the unusual steadiness of their heartbeats, and the slightly lower body temperature that characterized their physiology could be detected by careful observers, but such differences were subtle enough to escape notice in most social interactions. The loneliness that defined so much of vampire existence stemmed not from simple social isolation but from the fundamental impossibility of sharing their true nature with the mortal beings among whom they lived. Even vampires who successfully integrated into human communities and formed meaningful relationships were forced to maintain constant vigilance about revealing aspects of their identity that would transform friendship into fear, acceptance into persecution. The psychological burden of perpetual deception, of knowing that their closest human companions would flee in terror if they discovered the truth, created forms of isolation that were more profound than mere physical solitude. The question of whether higher vampires were capable of genuine moral development or whether their apparent ethical choices were merely sophisticated forms of self-interest remained one of the most complex and contentious issues in vampire-human relations. Regis's transformation from predator to healer provided compelling evidence that vampire nature was not immutably fixed, that conscious choice and sustained effort could reshape even the most fundamental aspects of their psychology and behavior. His decades of abstinence from human blood and dedication to protecting rather than harming mortal life demonstrated possibilities for change that challenged deterministic views of vampire nature. Yet the ease with which Detlev had abandoned his philosophical commitment to avoiding harm when faced with personal betrayal suggested that vampire moral development might be more fragile and situational than his example initially appeared to indicate. The speed with which love and trust had transformed into rage and vengeance raised questions about whether vampire emotions were subject to the same stabilizing influences that helped humans maintain consistent ethical behavior across changing circumstances. The possibility that vampire morality was more dependent on favorable conditions than on internalized principles created ongoing concerns about the reliability of peaceful coexistence between the species. The integration strategies that proved most successful for vampires attempting to live among humans required not just careful attention to concealing their supernatural nature, but genuine commitment to understanding and respecting mortal values and concerns. The vampires who achieved long-term success in human communities were those who approached integration not as a performance to be maintained, but as a learning opportunity that could enrich their understanding of consciousness and social organization. The physicians, scholars, and craftsmen who happened to be vampires contributed genuine value to the communities they served, their enhanced capabilities and extended experience providing benefits that justified the risks their presence might theoretically represent. The failure of integration efforts typically resulted not from exposure of vampire identity, but from the psychological pressures that accumulated over decades of maintaining false personas and suppressing natural impulses. The vampires who eventually abandoned their attempts at human integration often did so not because their deceptions had been discovered, but because the emotional cost of perpetual vigilance had become unbearable. The choice between authenticity and safety was one that each vampire had to navigate individually, with no guarantee that either path would lead to satisfaction or fulfillment. The classification disputes that surrounded creatures like Oriana revealed the practical difficulties of determining which supernatural beings qualified as higher vampires and which represented lesser forms of vampiric existence. The intelligence and social sophistication that she displayed suggested capabilities that exceeded those of ordinary lesser vampires, while her apparent vulnerability to conventional weapons indicated that she lacked the true immortality that defined higher vampire status. The ambiguity surrounding such borderline cases reflected the complexity of vampire taxonomy and the challenges faced by those attempting to understand supernatural hierarchies from external observation. The predatory behavior that even supposedly reformed vampires occasionally exhibited served as constant reminders that their fundamental nature remained alien to human sensibilities, regardless of their philosophical commitments or moral development. Oriana's maintenance of the orphanage, where she fed upon children, represented not necessarily conscious cruelty, but the practical application of vampire logic to resource management problems, creating sustainable feeding arrangements that served her needs while providing genuine benefits to her victims. The horror that humans felt upon discovering such arrangements reflected not just moral outrage, but recognition of how completely different vampire and human approaches to ethical decision-making could be. The future prospects for vampire-human coexistence depended upon both species developing more sophisticated understanding of their fundamental differences while recognizing the common ground that might provide foundations for mutual respect and cooperation. The humans who had learned to work alongside vampires like Regis discovered that such partnerships could produce benefits that neither species could achieve alone, combining mortal innovation and urgency with immortal knowledge and persistence. The medical advances, scholarly achievements, and technological developments that emerged from such collaboration demonstrated the potential value of overcoming fear and prejudice in favor of practical cooperation. The ongoing challenges faced by both species in their attempts to coexist peacefully included not just the practical problems of concealment and integration, but the deeper philosophical questions about identity, purpose, and moral responsibility that arose when beings of such different natures attempted to share the same world. The vampires who chose to dedicate themselves to serving mortal interests found meaning and satisfaction that their original nature had never provided, while the humans who learned to see past supernatural differences to recognize individual character and commitment discovered allies whose capabilities far exceeded anything available through conventional relationships. The wisdom gained through centuries of vampire-human interaction suggested that the potential for understanding and cooperation between radically different forms of intelligent life was limited primarily by willingness to acknowledge and accommodate differences rather than attempting to eliminate or ignore them. The vampires who tried to become human inevitably failed, while those who found ways to be authentically vampire while serving human interests achieved forms of integration that satisfied both their nature and their chosen moral principles. The humans who attempted to treat vampires as merely powerful humans consistently misunderstood their motivations and capabilities, while those who learned to appreciate vampire perspectives gained insights that enriched their own understanding of existence. The legacy of figures like Regis demonstrated that redemption and moral growth were possible even for beings whose nature seemed to preclude such development, while the tragedy of Detlef served as a warning about the consequences of failing to find constructive channels for immortal emotions and capabilities. The higher vampires who succeeded in creating meaningful lives within mortal society were those who found ways to use their alien nature in service of goals that transcended species boundaries, contributing to the welfare of all intelligent beings, rather than pursuing narrow self-interest or species loyalty. The ongoing evolution of vampire-human relations would continue to be shaped by individual choices and personal relationships, rather than by formal agreements or institutional policies, reflecting the reality that trust and understanding between such different forms of consciousness could only develop through direct experience and mutual demonstration of good faith. The future that awaited both species would be determined by their willingness to learn from past mistakes while remaining open to possibilities that neither had previously imagined, creating new forms of cooperation and understanding that honored the essential nature of both vampires and humans while transcending the limitations that had historically kept them apart. The profound questions raised by the existence of higher vampires would continue to challenge human assumptions about consciousness, mortality, and the nature of intelligent life long after the immediate crises of coexistence had been resolved. The recognition that beings of such power and longevity could choose to dedicate themselves to serving rather than exploiting shorter-lived species provided hope for the possibility of wisdom and compassion transcending biological boundaries. While the awareness that such choices were neither automatic nor permanent maintained the vigilance necessary for continued peaceful relations between species whose fundamental differences would never be completely reconciled. And so concludes our journey into the shadowed realm of the higher vampires, beings whose existence challenges everything we think we understand about life, death, and the nature of monsters. We have walked alongside creatures older than civilizations, witnessed their struggles to find meaning in endless existence, and seen how even immortals must confront questions of morality and purpose that transcend the boundaries of species and time itself. Through the ancient chronicles of their origins, we have learned that these beings were not born from human corruption or divine punishment, but arrived as refugees from cosmic catastrophe, aliens in the truest sense whose very biology operates according to principles that our world had never before encountered. Their immortality is not the blessing that mortal imaginations often portray it as, but a complex condition that brings both extraordinary capabilities and burdens that no finite mind can fully comprehend. The regeneration that allows them to survive complete physical destruction comes at the cost of experiencing forms of consciousness and suffering that exist beyond our vocabulary to describe. The society they built in their exile reflects both their alien nature and their attempts to adapt to a world dominated by beings whose lifespans measure decades rather than millennia. Their laws, born from the recognition that creatures capable of permanent mutual destruction must find alternatives to violence, created frameworks for coexistence that operated in shadows so complete that most mortals remained unaware of the hidden civilization that had developed among them. The strongholds they constructed and the technologies they developed demonstrated capabilities that combined their ancient knowledge with the resources of their adopted world, creating wonders that exceeded anything achieved by purely mortal science. Yet beneath the impressive achievements of vampire civilization lay contradictions and moral failures that revealed the depths to which even sophisticated beings could descend when they abandoned ethical constraints in pursuit of practical advantages. The systematic exploitation of human populations during their early centuries of settlement, the clinical studies that reduced intelligent beings to experimental subjects, the breeding programs that treated consciousness itself as a renewable resource, all testified to what happened when immortal intelligence operated without the moral boundaries that limited shorter-lived species. In Regis, we found proof that redemption was possible even for beings whose nature seemed to preclude such transformation, that the appetites and compulsions that had defined vampire existence for millennia could be overcome through conscious choice and sustained moral effort. His journey from blood-drunk predator to compassionate healer demonstrated that the mutations which had created witches to hunt monsters had not succeeded in destroying the capacity for growth and change that lay at the heart of all conscious existence. The decades he spent regenerating beneath the earth after his first death provided him with the enforced contemplation necessary to recognize the horror of his former actions and commit to fundamental change. His friendship with Geralt revealed possibilities for understanding between species that transcended the mere tolerance that most vampire-human relationships achieved, creating bonds based on mutual respect for shared values rather than simple necessity or convenience. The Witcher who had dedicated his life to hunting monsters recognized in the vampire someone whose commitment to protecting innocent life had overcome the predatory instincts that defined his nature, while Regis found in Geralt someone whose own struggles with dual identity created empathy that pure mortals or vampires might never achieve. In Detlaff, we witnessed the tragic consequences of isolation and betrayal upon a consciousness that had spent centuries avoiding the moral complexities of existence among other intelligent beings. His campaign of revenge against Beauclair was not the random violence of a creature driven by bloodlust, but the calculated response of someone whose philosophical framework had been shattered by experiences he was unprepared to process. The love that had drawn him from centuries of self-imposed exile became the catalyst for destruction when it proved to be built upon deceptions that called into question everything he had believed about the possibility of genuine, connection between vampires and mortals. The transformation of his protective instincts into instruments of terror demonstrated how quickly immortal capabilities could be turned from constructive to destructive purposes when guided by emotions that recognized no boundaries or limitations. The Night of Long Fangs that he unleashed upon the duchy served as a reminder of what vampire power could accomplish when freed from the restraints of civilization and moral consideration, while his ultimate fate illustrated the terrible cost of choices that placed personal grievance above the welfare of innocent populations. The Unseen Elder in his impossible domain represented the apex of vampire evolution, a being so ancient and powerful that normal categories of existence could no longer contain or describe his nature. His guardianship of the gateway between worlds reflected responsibilities that stretched back to the conjunction of the spheres itself, while his absolute authority over all other vampires demonstrated hierarchy based not on political appointment, but on recognition of power, relationships that transcended negotiation or resistance. The isolation that characterized his existence was not mere preference but necessity, the inevitable consequence of consciousness that operated on scales incompatible with normal social interaction. The final confrontation between Regis and Dettlaff forced both ancient friends to confront the ultimate implications of their philosophical differences, revealing that even immortal bonds could be severed when fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility could not be reconciled through reason or compromise. The violation of the sacred law that had governed vampire society for millennia, Regis's choice to kill another of his own kind, represented not just personal tragedy, but a transformation in vampire civilization that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate participants. The lessons we learn from studying these remarkable beings extend far beyond questions of monster hunting or supernatural defense to touch upon universal themes of identity, purpose, and the possibility of moral development that challenge comfortable assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. The vampires who succeeded in creating meaningful lives within mortal society were those who found ways to use their alien nature in service of goals that transcended species boundaries, while those who failed did so not because of their supernatural capabilities, but because of their inability to find constructive channels for immortal emotions and needs. The traditional defenses that folklore prescribed against vampire threats proved largely ineffective against higher vampires, whose capabilities transcend the limitations that such measures might impose upon lesser supernatural beings. The garlic, wooden stakes, holy water, and religious symbols that were supposed to provide protection have no power over creatures whose existence operates independently of human spiritual frameworks, and whose alien biology renders such substances harmless. The mirrors that were supposed to reveal their nature show their reflections normally, while sunlight affects them no more than any other environmental condition. The true nature of higher vampires is revealed not through supernatural detection, but through careful observation of behavioral patterns and subtle physical characteristics that require specific knowledge and extended contact to recognize. Their enhanced reflexes, unusual strength, modified breathing patterns, and slightly different body temperature can be detected by trained observers, but such differences are subtle enough to escape notice in casual social interaction. The invisibility they achieve comes not from magical concealment, but from careful attention to blending into human society through behavior rather than relying on supernatural camouflage. The future of vampire-human relations will continue to be shaped by individual choices and personal relationships rather than formal agreements or institutional policies, reflecting the reality that trust between such different forms of consciousness can only develop through direct experience and mutual demonstration of good faith. The vampires who choose to dedicate themselves to serving mortal interests discover meaning that their original nature never provided, while the humans who learn to see past supernatural differences to recognize individual character gain allies whose capabilities exceed anything available through conventional relationships. The profound questions raised by higher vampire existence will continue to challenge our assumptions about consciousness, mortality, and intelligent life long after immediate crises have been resolved. Their presence in our world serves as a reminder that the universe contains forms of awareness and capability that transcend our normal categories of understanding, beings whose power could destroy or protect depending upon the choices they make and the values they embrace. As you drift towards sleep, let these timeless stories guide you into peaceful dreams where understanding conquers fear, and even the most alien natures can choose compassion over cruelty. Rest now in the knowledge that consciousness itself, whether mortal or immortal, human or vampire, carries within it the potential for growth, wisdom, and the choice to serve life rather than destroy it. The darkness that surrounds us is not filled only with monsters, but with beings whose struggles to find meaning and purpose mirror our own, whose capacity for both destruction and redemption reminds us that the true measure of any intelligence lies not in its power, but in how it chooses to use that power in service of something greater than itself. Sleep well, knowing that even in the most impossible circumstances, even when nature itself seems to preclude the possibility of goodness, conscious choice can still triumph over instinct. Love can overcome betrayal, and hope can survive in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender to despair. The higher vampires have taught us that immortality without wisdom is merely endless repetition of mistake and suffering, but that consciousness guided by compassion and moral courage can transform even the most alien nature into something worthy of respect and admiration. Dream of worlds where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where understanding bridges the gaps between incompatible forms of existence, and where the choice to protect rather than exploit provides meaning that transcends the boundaries of species, time, and mortality itself.